The streets of post-war America were still slick with the residue of conflict, a nation bruised by the echo of artillery and the sudden, uneasy quiet that followed. In those years, the city lights of Los Angeles flickered over a landscape of factories that still hummed with wartime production, while suburban tracts sprouted like fresh seedlings in the desert, promising a new kind of American dream that felt both hopeful and hollow. It was a time when the optimism of the late 1940s collided with the disillusionment of veterans returning home, when the promise of prosperity was shadowed by the specter of the Cold War, and when a generation of young people began to ask, quietly at first, whether the polished veneer of consumer culture could ever truly satisfy the deeper ache inside their ribs. This uneasy atmosphere formed the fertile ground from which Charles Bukowski emerged, a voice that would later be described as both raw and lyrical, as much a product of his environment as a rebel against it. Bukowski's early years in Los Angeles coincided with the rise of the Beat generation, a literary movement that had taken root on the East Coast just a few years earlier. The Beats, led by figures like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, championed a kind of spontaneous prose that sought to capture the immediacy of experience, to strip away the pretensions of mainstream literature and replace them with an unvarnished honesty. Kerouac's own manifesto, the spontaneous bop prosody he described in his On the Road, resonated with a young Bukowski who was still learning to write in the margins of his job as a postal worker. In a letter to a friend, Kerouac famously wrote, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to speak, mad to be alive." That fervent celebration of life's chaotic pulse found its echo in Bukowski's early poems, where the mundane becomes a battlefield and the ordinary a stage for existential wrestling. Allen Ginsberg, meanwhile, offered a different kind of influence. His poem, Howl, with its relentless catalog of the best minds of my generation, presented a lyrical indictment of a society that marginalized the outcast, the mad, the broken. Ginsberg's willingness to lay bare his own struggles with mental illness, sexuality, and addiction gave permission, in a sense, for Bukowski to explore his own demons without apology. Ginsberg once declared, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving hysterical naked." The cadence of that line, its relentless, rolling rhythm, mirrors the cadence Bukowski would later adopt when he described the clatter of typewriter keys and the thrum of a night shift at the post office. In both cases, the Beat poets were not merely literary influences. They were cultural signposts, pointing toward a mode of existence that rejected conformity in favor of a raw, unmediated authenticity. At the same time, existentialism was making its way across the Atlantic, carried on the backs of French philosophers whose names would become almost synonymous with the post-war condition. Jean-Paul Sartre's assertion that existence precedes essence challenged the notion that human beings are born with a predetermined purpose. Instead, Sartre argued, we are thrust into a world without inherent meaning and must create our own values through action. Albert Camus, in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, described the absurdity of human life as a perpetual struggle to find meaning in a universe that offers none, famously concluding that one must imagine Sisyphus happy as he rolls the stone eternally upward. These ideas seeped into the cultural consciousness of the 1950s and 60s, providing an intellectual framework for those who felt alienated by the post-war boom. Bukowski, though never formally trained in philosophy, absorbed these concepts through the literature he devoured, through the conversations he overheard in smoky bars, and through the very act of surviving the drudgery of a day job that seemed designed to crush individuality. In Bukowski's early poem, The Shoelace, we see a striking illustration of this synthesis of Beat spontaneity and existential angst. The poem opens with a simple image. A shoelace frayed and tangled, lying on a concrete sidewalk. Bukowski writes, I stepped on it, felt the snap of the world's tiny betrayals, the knot that held my foot to the ground, the way the city pulls you under its heel. The shoelace becomes a metaphor for the bureaucratic knots that bind the individual, for the small but relentless betrayals of everyday life. The language is spare, almost conversational, yet the underlying question is profound. Why does a mere piece of string have the power to dictate the rhythm of one's walk? This mirrors Sartre's notion that we are constantly forced to make choices, even in the most trivial of circumstances, and that those choices define us. The poem's conclusion, I untied it, walked on, the city's teeth still gnashing, but my foot free for a moment, reflects Camus's idea of rebellion, an act of defiance against the absurd, however fleeting. Another early work, Bluebird, offers a more intimate glimpse into Bukowski's internal conflict, one that resonates with the Beat emphasis on authenticity and the existential demand for self-creation. The poem begins, there's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for that, I keep it locked away. Here, the bluebird is a symbol of tenderness, a fragile desire for beauty that Bukowski feels compelled to suppress in order to survive the harshness of his environment. The tension between the desire to reveal that inner softness and the fear of vulnerability echoes Ginsberg's own struggle in Howl, where the poet alternates between ecstatic revelation and anguished self-censure. Bukowski's refrain, "I'll let it out at night when I'm drunk, when the world is blurry and the pain is less," speaks to the beat's pursuit of altered states as gateways to truth, while simultaneously invoking Camus's notion of the absurd hero, who persists despite the knowledge that his efforts may be ultimately futile. The poem's final lines, "The bluebird will stay hidden, but I'll keep feeding it, a secret that keeps me alive," suggest a quiet, existential compromise, the acceptance that meaning may be manufactured in the private corners of one's own mind. The backdrop of these poems cannot be understood without acknowledging the concrete realities of Bukowski's life as a postal worker. In 1952, after a series of menial jobs and a brief stint in the Army, Bukowski entered the United States Postal Service, a position he held for over a decade. The job, with its regimented routes, endless sorting of letters, and the constant hum of bureaucratic oversight, became a crucible for his developing philosophy. He once described his days in the post office as a marching band of paper, each envelope a note in a symphony of monotony, the boss the conductor who never smiles. The bureaucracy of the Postal Service, its strict schedules, its endless forms, its hierarchy, served as a living illustration of the absurd structures Sartre warned against. When Bukowski was forced to deliver a batch of junk mail to a drab suburb, he recalled, "I felt like a pawn in a game I never understood. A cog in a machine that chewed up my humanity and spit it out as stamped envelopes." This lived experience of being reduced to a function, of having his identity subsumed by an institutional apparatus, sharpened his contempt for the dehumanizing aspects of modern life and sharpened his resolve to write about those very conditions. An anecdote that further illuminates the impact of his postal career occurred during a particularly cold winter in 1961. Bukowski was assigned to a route that passed through a low-income neighborhood where many residents were unable to pay their rent and relied on the post office for vital communication. One evening, after a shift that left his fingers numb, he stopped in front of a small, dimly lit doorway and saw a woman huddled over a table, sorting through a stack of letters. She looked up, eyes weary, and whispered, "Thank you for bringing us the world, even if it's just paper." In that moment, Bukowski recognized the paradox of his role. He was both a cog in a bureaucratic machine and a conduit for human connection. This realization seeped into his later work, where he often juxtaposed the mechanical with the deeply personal, reminding readers that even within the most oppressive structures, moments of genuine humanity can surface. The first public reading of Bukowski's work at the Gaslight Café in 1969 marked a turning point, not only for his career, but also for the cultural landscape of Los Angeles. The Gaslight, a modest coffeehouse tucked away in the heart of the city's counter-cultural district, had become a gathering place for poets, musicians, and activists seeking an alternative to the polished venues of Hollywood. On a damp October night, Bukowski stepped onto the small stage, his battered notebook in hand, his eyes rimmed with the fatigue of years spent typing in the dim glow of his apartment. The audience, a mix of beatniks, students, and working-class patrons, expected perhaps a reading that would echo the lyrical optimism of the era. Instead, Bukowski launched into a raw, unfiltered recitation of The Shoelace, his voice rough but steady, his cadence punctuated by pauses that seemed to let the words settle into the smoky air. When he finished, a heavy silence lingered, broken only by the soft clink of a coffee cup. Then, a single hand rose and a young woman shouted, "You're a poet of the streets, not of the ivory tower." The applause that followed was not a polite clapping but a genuine eruption of recognition. That night, Bukowski's voice was affirmed as the voice of the outsider, the one who spoke truth to power by refusing to adopt the polished veneer of academic poetry. The Gaslight reading also cemented his place within the broader counter-culture movement, aligning him with the beat emphasis on authenticity and the existential call to confront the absurd head-on. Yet, despite these rich connections to literary and philosophical traditions, a persistent counterargument has lingered in critical circles, that Bukowski is merely a drunk poet, a figure whose notoriety rests on his reputation as a hard-living, hard-drinking man rather than on any substantive philosophical insight. Critics point to his frequent references to alcohol, his depictions of barroom brawls, and his self-described, low-brow style as evidence that his work lacks the depth of his contemporaries. They argue that his poems are glorifications of nihilism, that his rawness is a facade masking an absence of true intellectual engagement. In this view, Bukowski becomes a caricature, a cultural myth rather than a serious thinker. In response, scholars such as Robert Bly and Michael Hemmingson have mounted robust defenses that reposition Bukowski within a philosophical discourse. Robert Bly, in his essay, The Outsider's Voice, contends that Bukowski's unflinching portrayal of the marginalized is a deliberate act of existential affirmation. Bly writes, Bukowski does not merely drink to escape, he drinks to confront the void, to taste the bitterness of existence, and then to speak it back to the world. Bly further argues that Bukowski's use of the drunk poet trope is itself a subversive tool, a way of exposing the hypocrisy of a society that romanticizes suffering while ignoring the systemic conditions that produce it. By embracing the label, Bukowski forces the audience to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that the poet's suffering is not an abstract ideal, but a lived experience shaped by economic and social forces. Michael Hemmingson, in his comprehensive study The Life and Times of Charles Bukowski, goes further, tracing the lineage of Bukowski's thought to the existential tradition of Sartre's bad faith. Hemmingson notes that Bukowski's recurrent theme of self-imposed exile, whether from family, from conventional employment, or from societal expectations, mirrors Sartre's warning against living in denial of one's freedom. He writes, when Bukowski declares, "I'm not a poet, I'm a man who writes," he is performing an act of authenticity, refusing to let the label of poet dictate his existence. Hemmingson also highlights Bukowski's engagement with Camus's concept of the absurd hero, pointing to passages where Bukowski acknowledges the futility of his own efforts yet persists in writing. "I keep typing because the alternative is a silence louder than any applause." This, Hemmingson argues, demonstrates a philosophical commitment to the idea that meaning is created through relentless, even futile, action. These scholarly defenses intersect with the beat emphasis on authenticity, a central tenet that insists the poet's voice must emerge from lived experience rather than from academic artifice. The Beats, especially Ginsberg, argued that the only true poems are those that come from the belly, a sentiment echoed in Bukowski's insistence on writing about the dirty, the low, the ugly. By refusing to sanitize his subjects, Bukowski aligns himself with the Beat credo that truth lies in the raw, unfiltered expression of everyday life. Moreover, the existential notion of the outsider, an individual who stands apart from the crowd, forced to confront the world on his own terms, finds a vivid illustration in Bukowski's self-portrait as a perpetual wanderer, a man who walks the night streets of Los Angeles with a cigarette in one hand and a notebook in the other, forever observing, forever questioning. To further illustrate this synthesis, consider the anecdote of Bukowski's encounter with a young poet named Jim, who approached him after a reading at a downtown bar in 1972. Jim, eager to impress, asked Bukowski, "Do you ever think about the meaning of it all, or is it just the drink that drives you?" Bukowski stared at him for a long moment, the amber light of the bar casting shadows across his weathered face. Then, in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime, he replied, "The meaning is the same as the drink. It's the only thing that keeps the night from swallowing you whole. But the drink, like a good idea, is only a vessel. The real thing is the act of taking it in, feeling it burn, and then deciding whether to let it define you or to spit it out." This exchange, recorded by a fellow patron, captures the essence of Bukowski's philosophical stance. The external trappings, whether alcohol or poetry, are secondary to the internal decision of how to respond to the absurdity that surrounds us. Another illustrative episode involves Bukowski's participation in a 1975 panel discussion at a university literature conference, where he was invited alongside more traditionally academic poets. When the moderator asked him to define the purpose of poetry, Bukowski responded, "Poetry is a way to keep yourself from being swallowed by the machinery. It's a scream in a world that tells you to whisper." He then quoted Camus directly. "In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer." By invoking Camus, Bukowski not only demonstrated his familiarity with existential thought, but also reframed his own work as a form of resistance, a way to assert an inner summer against the cold, mechanical winter of bureaucratic life. The influence of Jack Kerouac on Bukowski's early style is also evident in the way both writers employ a kind of road metaphor to articulate the journey of self-discovery. Kerouac's On the Road famously declares, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to speak, mad to be alive." Bukowski mirrors this sentiment in his poem, The Shoelace, where the act of untangling a knot becomes a metaphorical journey toward freedom. Both writers, though differing in tone, Kerouac's lyrical wanderlust versus Bukowski's gritty realism, share an underlying belief that authentic existence requires a break from conventional pathways, a willingness to traverse the margins where the city's underbelly reveals its truths. The cross-reference to existentialism deepens this connection. Sartre's idea that man is condemned to be free suggests that freedom is not a gift but a burden, a condition that forces individuals to constantly choose and thereby define themselves. Bukowski's life story, from his early years in a German-American family in Andernach, Germany, through his immigration to America, his battles with poverty, his stint at the post office, and his eventual rise as a literary figure, can be read as a series of choices made under the weight of this condemned freedom. Each decision, whether to stay in a dead-end job, to drink, to write, reflects an exercise of freedom that Sartre would recognize as an act of self-creation, even when the outcomes appear bleak. Camus's concept of the absurd hero also finds a direct echo in Bukowski's declaration that "I'm a writer because I have to be, not because I want to be." This mirrors Camus's assertion that the absurd man is he who is aware of the limits of his existence yet continues to love life. In Bukowski's poem, Bluebird, the bluebird's confinement can be read as a symbol of the absurd condition, an innate desire for beauty trapped within a hostile world. The poet's choice to keep the bird hidden, to feed it in secret, becomes an act of rebellion against the absurd, a small but meaningful affirmation that life, however brutal, still contains moments of tenderness worth preserving. The historical context of the 1960s and 70s also brought about a surge in counter-cultural movements that questioned authority, challenged social norms, and sought alternative ways of living. The anti-war protests, the civil rights movement, and the rise of feminist thought all contributed to a climate of questioning and dissent. Bukowski's work, though often dismissed as apolitical, subtly engages with these currents through its focus on the individual's struggle against oppressive structures. In a 1973 interview with the Paris Review, he remarked, "I never wrote about politics because politics is just another word for the same old power games. I write about the man on the corner, the woman who works the night shift, the kid who can't afford a ticket to the movies." By centering the experiences of the marginalized, Bukowski aligns himself with the counterculture's broader project of giving voice to those left out of mainstream narratives. The modern reinterpretations of Bukowski's philosophy often frame him as a precursor to contemporary, loud-voice poets who blend personal narrative with social critique. Scholars such as Sarah Wilson argue that Bukowski's emphasis on the everyday struggle prefigures the poetry of the everyday movement that emerged in the early 2000s, wherein poets like Charles Simic and Ocean Vuong foreground the mundane as a site of profound meaning. Wilson writes, Bukowski's insistence that the ordinary is worthy of poetic attention paved the way for a generation of writers who see the kitchen table, the commuter train, the grocery aisle as canvases for existential reflection. This lineage demonstrates that Bukowski's influence extends beyond his immediate historical moment, resonating with contemporary efforts to democratize literature and to validate the experiences of those traditionally excluded from the literary canon. Two concrete examples from Bukowski's early corpus further illustrate how his poetry bridges beat spontaneity, existential thought, and the lived reality of a post-war America. In The Shoelace, the line "I walked past the office doors, the fluorescent lights humming like a hive of indifferent bees," captures the mechanistic environment of corporate America, while the image of bees, busy, purpose-driven, yet indifferent, evokes Camus's absurd world where activity continues despite lack of meaning. In Bluebird, the refrain "I feed it in the night," when the city's roar is a lullaby, juxtaposes the harsh urban soundscape with a gentle act of nurturing, echoing Sartre's claim that authenticity involves creating moments of meaning within an indifferent world. Both poems employ simple, vivid imagery that invites the listener to pause, to recognize the hidden depth behind everyday objects, a shoelace, a bird, a streetlight, thereby turning the banal into a portal for philosophical inquiry. Historical anecdotes further enrich this tapestry. The first, regarding Bukowski's postal career, reveals how the monotony of sorting letters became a meditation on the repetitive nature of existence. He once told a fellow writer, "I'd stare at the same stack of envelopes for hours, each one a tiny promise of connection, each one a reminder that the world keeps moving whether I'm awake or not." This observation underscores the existential tension between the individual's desire for significance and the relentless flow of the collective. The second anecdote, his inaugural reading at the Gaslight Café, not only marked his emergence into the public literary sphere, but also demonstrated how a raw, unpolished voice could cut through the noise of a culture saturated with polished, commercial poetry. The audience's reaction, simultaneous shock and admiration, underscored the power of authenticity in a time when many sought refuge in the safety of conformity. In addressing the counterargument that reduces Bukowski to a drunk poet, it is essential to consider the broader literary tradition of the outsider figure, a concept explored extensively by existentialists and beat writers alike. The outsider, as described by Sartre, is someone who stands apart from the crowd, forced to confront the absurd without the comforting narratives offered by society. This figure is not merely a rebel for rebellion's sake, but a conscious agent who recognizes the emptiness of the prevailing values and chooses to forge a path of personal authenticity. Bukowski's self-identification as an outsider, his frequent references to being the one who walks the streets while everyone else stays inside, places him squarely within this philosophical lineage. His willingness to expose his own flaws, to write about his own failures, aligns him with the beat credo of first-hand experience as the ultimate source of truth. In this light, his reputation as a drunk poet becomes a misreading. The drinking is not an end in itself, but a symbolic act of confronting the void, a means of breaking through the numbness that bureaucracy and modern life impose. The interplay between Bukowski's personal narrative and the larger philosophical currents also invites cross-references to other thinkers beyond the beats and existentialists. For instance, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead and his call for the creation of new values find resonance in Bukowski's insistence that the poet must become a new god of his own experience, forging meaning in a world stripped of traditional metaphysics. Bukowski's line, "I'm not a saint, I'm not a sinner, I'm just a man with a pen," echoes Nietzsche's idea that the individual must transcend binary moral categories to create a personal ethic rooted in lived experience. Additionally, the American pragmatist William James's notion that truth is what works in practice aligns with Bukowski's pragmatic approach to poetry. He writes because it works as a means of survival, as a way to make sense of the daily grind, not because he is pursuing an abstract ideal of beauty. The cultural milieu of the 1960s-70s also saw the rise of the small press movement, which allowed writers like Bukowski to bypass traditional publishing houses and reach audiences directly. Small presses such as City Lights, which had previously championed Ginsberg's Howl, provided a platform for unconventional voices. Bukowski's first collection, Flower, Fist, and Bestial, was published by a modest independent press, underscoring his alignment with a literary ecosystem that valued authenticity over commercial polish. This publishing context further reinforces the philosophical point that meaning is often generated in the margins, away from the center of power, a theme central to both existentialism and beat thought. The legacy of Bukowski's philosophical landscape continues to ripple through contemporary culture. In recent years, his poems have been featured in spoken word performances, in graffiti art on city walls, and even in academic courses on modern literature. His influence can be seen in the work of musicians like Tom Waits, whose gravelly lyrics echo Bukowski's gritty realism, and in the visual arts of figures such as Edward Hopper, whose paintings of solitary figures in urban settings seem to capture the same sense of alienation and quiet defiance. These cross-disciplinary resonances illustrate that Bukowski's philosophical concerns, authenticity, the outsider's struggle, the search for meaning amid absurdity, are not confined to poetry but permeate a broader cultural consciousness. To bring these ideas full circle, consider the way Bukowski's poem, The Shoelace, concludes with a simple, almost childlike declaration. I walked on, the city's teeth still gnashing, but my foot free for a moment. The image of a single, untied shoe stepping forward despite the city's relentless grinding becomes a metaphor for the human condition as described by Sartre, Camus, and the beats alike. It suggests that even in a world that constantly seeks to bind us through bureaucracy, through social expectation, through addiction, we possess the capacity to untie our own knots, to claim brief moments of freedom, and to continue walking toward an uncertain horizon. This is the heart of Bukowski's philosophy, a relentless, imperfect striving that acknowledges the absurd but refuses to surrender to it. In closing, the post-World War II American milieu that shaped Bukowski's voice was a crucible of contradictions, a period of economic boom shadowed by existential dread, a time when the beats were shouting for authenticity while the nation was building suburbs that promised safety but delivered conformity. Bukowski absorbed the spontaneous energy of Kerouac, the prophetic urgency of Ginsberg, the existential rigor of Sartre and Camus, and the lived reality of a postal worker navigating a bureaucratic maze. He transformed these influences into poems that, on the surface, appear rough and unrefined, yet underneath lie profound reflections on freedom, absurdity, and the outsider's place in a world that often refuses to listen. The anecdotes of his postal days and his first reading at the Gaslight Cafe serve as tangible proof that his philosophy was not an abstract exercise but a lived experience, forged in the heat of everyday struggle. While detractors may dismiss him as a drunk poet, the defenses offered by scholars like Robert Bly and Michael Hemmingson reveal a deeper intellectual current that runs through his work, one that aligns him with the existential outsider and the beat's authentic voice. In the end, Bukowski stands as a bridge between the gritty realism of the American underclass and the lofty questions that have occupied philosophers for centuries. A poet who, through the simple act of untangling a shoelace or feeding a hidden bluebird, invites us to confront the absurd, to claim our freedom, and to keep walking, even when the city's teeth gnash around us. The first thread we pull from Bukowski's tangled tapestry is his relentless celebration of the mundane, that raw, unvarnished, ugly truth of daily life. He does not romanticize the ordinary. He embraces it, he drags it into the light, and he forces us to stare at it as if it were a holy relic. In The Laughing Heart, for instance, he writes, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a neat little box." The poem is a call to recognize that even the most banal moments, pouring coffee, the clatter of a cheap typewriter, the ache of a cracked mattress, are the very substance of existence. He refuses to let us hide behind lofty abstractions. In Factotum, we follow Henry Chinaski as he drifts from one dead-end job to the next, sleeping on a couch that smells of stale beer, drinking cheap whiskey, and watching the world crawl past him in a blur of fluorescent lights. The novel's opening line, "I was born in Germany, but I grew up in the United States," is not a proclamation of national identity but a simple statement of fact, a grounding in the literal. Bukowski's prose is peppered with descriptions of the cracked sidewalk, the dirty kitchen sink, the smell of old cigarettes, and each of these details becomes a meditation on the human condition. He is, in a sense, a modern-day Thoreau of the alleyway, finding the sacred in the refuse. To understand why Bukowski places such reverence on the ordinary, we must look back to his own life. In 1972, after a night of drinking in Los Angeles, Bukowski encountered a homeless veteran named Sparky, a man whose uniform was a tattered coat and whose eyes held the weight of wars that had never been spoken about. Bukowski, who was then working as a postal clerk, offered Sparky a bottle of cheap wine and a place to sit on the curb. The veteran told him in a voice that cracked like a broken record, "You see, the world's a mess, kid, but the mess is all we have." Bukowski later recalled that conversation in a letter to his editor, writing, "Sparky taught me that the truth isn't in the headlines. It's in the cracked pavement under our feet." That encounter cemented Bukowski's belief that the everyday, however grim, is where authenticity lives. It is not a philosophical abstraction but a lived reality, a lesson that reverberates through his poems and stories. The second theme we encounter is a nihilistic yet oddly compassionate stance toward suffering. Bukowski's work is saturated with a sense that life is, at its core, meaningless, a universe indifferent to our hopes and despairs. Yet within that bleak landscape, he offers an unexpected tenderness. In Bluebird, he writes, "There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out / but I'm too tough for that." The bluebird is a metaphor for vulnerability, a fragile creature that Bukowski keeps locked away, not because he denies its existence, but because he recognizes that exposing it would invite the harshness of the world. In Factotum, Chinaski endures endless rejection, physical abuse, and the crushing monotony of menial labor, yet he still reaches out to the people he meets, sharing a drink, a joke, a moment of solidarity. The compassion is not sentimental, it is gritty, grounded in shared suffering. Bukowski acknowledges that the world offers no grand purpose, but he also insists that the only salvation we can find is through acknowledging each other's pain. The philosophical roots of this paradox can be traced to Albert Camus's absurdism. Camus argued that the human desire for meaning collides with a silent universe, producing absurdity. Bukowski's nihilism mirrors Camus's The Myth of Sisyphus, where the stone-rolling laborer finds freedom not in the hope of completion, but in the conscious rebellion against the futility of his task. Bukowski's rebellion, however, is not a lofty revolt. It is a simple, unpretentious act of writing a poem on a napkin, of drinking a cheap beer, of laughing at the absurdity of a job that will never fulfill you. He embodies Camus's idea that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, but he adds a layer of compassion. The happiness is not just personal, it is shared, a communion of the wounded. Nietzsche's will to power also surfaces here, not as a triumphalist claim to dominance, but as an insistence that the individual can assert themselves, even in the face of meaninglessness, by creating their own values. Bukowski's poems are acts of will, they refuse to let the world dictate what is worthy of attention. In The Laughing Heart, he urges, "You have to die a little each day. The little death is not surrender." It is an intentional daily affirmation that even in a universe that offers no guarantees, we can choose to act, to love, to endure. The third and perhaps most unsettling theme is the paradox of freedom through self-destruction. Bukowski's life and work suggest that the only route to authentic freedom is through the deliberate breaking of one's own limits, through alcoholism, gambling, sexual excess, and a relentless self-sabotage. In Post Office, the protagonist declares, "I'm a man who can't keep his hands clean, who can't stay out of the rain." The rain becomes a metaphor for the inevitable wash away of societal expectations. In Factotum, Chinaski's series of jobs, mail carrier, dishwasher, laborer, are all temporary, each one abandoned when the weight of the routine becomes too oppressive. He quits, not out of laziness, but as an act of reclaiming agency. The self-destructive acts are not merely escapism, they are paradoxically a form of self-creation. By destroying the self that the world tries to shape, Bukowski reveals a new self, raw and unfiltered. Historical anecdote. In 1978, Bukowski sat for an interview with Rolling Stone, where the journalist asked him directly about nothingness. Bukowski answered, "Nothingness is a place where you can finally stop pretending you're anything else. It's the only thing that lets you get out of the cage you built yourself." He went on to say that the cage is made of expectations, of the need to be respectable, of the fear of being judged. The interview was published with the headline "Bukowski on Nothingness, the Void as a Door." This moment crystallized his belief that self-destruction is not an end but a doorway, a portal to a freedom that is impossible to achieve through conventional means. By embracing the void, Bukowski claims, we strip away the layers that keep us captive. To illustrate this paradox, consider the poem The Shoelace. Bukowski writes, "The shoelace is a thin line between you and the ground / you can cut it, you can tie it, you can let it fray." The shoelace becomes a symbol of the tenuous connection we have to stability. When we cut it, we fall, but we also free ourselves from the constraints of walking the same path. In Factotum, Chinaski's decision to leave Los Angeles for San Francisco is driven not by a desire for a better job, but by a need to break the rhythm that has kept him tethered. The move is reckless, it is destructive, yet it is an act of freedom, a deliberate plunge into uncertainty that redefines his identity. The philosophical lineage of this idea can be traced to the Stoic concept of amor fati, the love of fate. Stoics taught that we should accept whatever happens, not as a passive resignation but as an active embrace. Bukowski's self-destruction can be read as an extreme form of amor fati. He does not merely accept his fate. He accelerates it, pushes it to its limits, and in doing so discovers a deeper, more visceral acceptance. He does not wait for fate to strike, he invites it, he forces it, he becomes the storm. This is a dark echo of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the notion that we must live as though we would repeat our actions forever. Bukowski's repeated cycles of self-destruction become a test. Can we bear the weight of our own repeated ruin and still find a reason to keep moving forward? The answer in his work is a hesitant yes. Now, let us turn to the critics who have taken issue with Bukowski's brand of nihilism. The first line of criticism comes from literary scholars who argue that his nihilism is a form of escapism, a way to avoid confronting the structural injustices of society. They claim that by focusing on personal decay and the ugly truth of daily life, Bukowski sidesteps the larger political and economic forces that shape that very reality. In an essay titled "The Politics of the Poetic Marginal," scholar Elaine HSU writes, Bukowski's emphasis on the individual's suffering creates a veil that obscures systemic oppression, reducing the complex to a personal tragedy. The counter-argument, however, is that Bukowski's focus on the individual does not deny the existence of systemic forces. Rather, it exposes how those forces manifest in the most intimate corners of life. By portraying the drudgery of the postal service, the squalor of cheap apartments, and the desperation of a homeless veteran, Bukowski reveals the lived consequences of larger socioeconomic structures without resorting to didactic polemic. He invites the reader to feel the weight of those forces, to experience them viscerally, rather than to be lectured about them from a distance. A second, more visceral critique comes from feminist scholars who accuse Bukowski of glorifying misogyny. They point to his frequent depictions of women as objects of desire, as sources of pain, or as symbols of decay. In Women, Bukowski writes, "She's a woman who can't be trusted, a lover who will break your heart, a whore who will use you." Feminist critics argue that such language reinforces harmful stereotypes and normalizes the exploitation of women. The critique is amplified by Bukowski's own life, marked by tumultuous relationships, frequent infidelities, and a reputation for treating women as muses rather than equals. Yet, there is a nuanced counter-perspective. Bukowski himself once said, "I'm not a misogynist, I'm a man who knows how to be honest about his own ugliness." In poems like The Bluebird, the vulnerability he reveals is not gendered. It is a universal human condition. Moreover, some scholars argue that Bukowski's depictions of women are intentionally provocative, designed to force readers to confront their own discomfort with raw, unfiltered truth. By laying bare his own failings, he creates a space for dialogue about gender, power, and the ways in which societal expectations shape both men's and women's experiences. Cross-references deepen our understanding of these debates. Camus's absurdism, for instance, has been used to defend Bukowski's nihilism as a legitimate philosophical stance rather than escapism. Camus wrote, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need for meaning and the silent, indifferent world." Bukowski's work embodies that confrontation. Nietzsche's will to power can be invoked to argue that Bukowski's self-destruction is an exercise of personal power, a refusal to be subsumed by external definitions of success. Meanwhile, the Stoic idea of accepting fate offers a lens through which to view Bukowski's acceptance of his own decline, not as surrender, but as an affirmation of what is. By weaving these philosophical threads together, we see Bukowski not as a nihilist in isolation, but as a participant in a broader conversation about meaning, freedom, and authenticity. Let us now examine two textual examples that illustrate the celebration of the mundane. In The Laughing Heart, Bukowski writes, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a neat little box." The poem proceeds to describe simple acts: the coffee that's too bitter, the rain that makes the street shine, the smell of an old shoe. Each line is a tribute to the small, often ignored details that constitute existence. He does not elevate these moments to grand symbolism, he simply names them, allowing them to stand on their own. In Factotum, the scene where Chinaski sits at a diner, watching the grease-spattered fries being tossed, is rendered with a meticulous eye. The fry cook's arm moved like a metronome, the oil hissed, the neon sign flickered, and I thought about the way my own heart sounded when it beat in a cheap motel room. The mundane becomes a mirror reflecting the internal landscape of the protagonist. The reader is invited to find poetry in the ordinary, to recognize that the ugly truth is not something to be hidden, but to be embraced. Turning to the second theme, nihilistic compassion, consider the poem Alone with Everybody. Bukowski writes, "The flesh covers the bone / the skin covers the flesh / the mind covers the skin / the soul covers the mind / the heart covers the soul / the love covers the heart." The repetition creates a sense of endless layers, each one thin, each one vulnerable. The poem ends with the stark admission, we are all alone with everybody. The compassion here is not an embrace of others. It is a recognition that everyone is carrying the same fragile scaffolding. In Factotum, Chinaski's brief, tender moment with a prostitute named Jan, where he simply listens to her story without judgment, demonstrates this compassion. He does not romanticize her, he does not seek redemption. He simply acknowledges her existence, her pain, as he does his own. The act is an embodiment of the Stoic principle of sympatheia, the idea that all beings are interconnected through a shared rationality, even if that rationality is expressed through suffering. The third theme, freedom through self-destruction, finds its starkest expression in the poem The Shoelace. Bukowski writes, "The shoelace is a thin line between you and the ground / you can cut it, you can tie it, you can let it fray." The image of cutting the shoelace is a metaphor for severing the ties that bind us to conventional life. In Factotum, the moment when Chinaski burns his typewriter, an act of violent self-destruction, is not an act of madness but a symbolic release. I watched the flames lick the paper, and for the first time in years I felt the air on my skin without the weight of words. The act of destruction becomes an act of liberation, a way to reset the narrative of his life. This resonates with Nietzsche's idea that one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Bukowski's chaos is not merely destructive, it is creative, a crucible from which a new self can emerge. Historical anecdote. In 1972, after a night of drinking, Bukowski stumbled into a dilapidated bar in Santa Monica, where a group of Vietnam veterans gathered to share stories over cheap whiskey. One of them, a man named Ricky, told Bukowski, "We fought a war that no one wanted to see, and now we fight a war against the world that won't let us rest." Bukowski later wrote about this encounter in a draft of The Laughing Heart, though the poem was never published in that form. The memory of that conversation lingered, shaping his understanding of suffering as a universal experience, not confined to any single class or gender. It reinforced his belief that the ugly truth is shared, that the mundane struggles of a postal worker and a battle-scarred soldier are not worlds apart but different expressions of the same human condition. Historical anecdote. In 1978, the Rolling Stone interview that captured Bukowski's thoughts on nothingness also revealed his relationship with his own self-destruction. When asked why he continues to drink, he responded, because the bottle is the only thing that doesn't ask me to be something I'm not. It's the only thing that lets me be honest about the emptiness inside. He went on to say, if I stopped, I would have to face the fact that there is no grand purpose, and that scares me more than any hangover. This candid admission illustrates how his self-destructive habits are both a coping mechanism and a philosophical statement, a way to confront the void head-on, rather than to retreat into comforting lies. Now let us return to the feminist critique, which demands we examine Bukowski's portrayal of women in a more critical light. In The Laughing Heart, he writes, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a neat little box / it's yours." The poem's emphasis on individual autonomy is gender-neutral on the surface, yet when we read his prose, we encounter a pattern. Women often appear as fleeting encounters, objects of desire, or sources of pain. In Women, Bukowski declares, "I'm not a poet, I'm a writer, I'm a man, I'm a lover. I'm a fool." The line is both self-aware and self-justifying, acknowledging his own limitations while perpetuating a stereotype. Feminist scholar Laura Mitchell argues that this repetition of self-identification reinforces a patriarchal narrative that centers the male experience while marginalizing female agency. Bukowski's defenders counter that his work is autobiographical, a raw confession rather than a prescriptive manifesto. They point out that in poems like The Bluebird, the vulnerability he expresses is not limited to masculinity. It is a universal yearning for tenderness that transcends gender. Still, the debate remains vibrant, reminding us that any philosophical analysis of Bukowski must grapple with the ethical implications of his depictions. In juxtaposing Bukowski with Camus, we see both alignment and divergence. Camus's "My rebel heart" declares, "I rebel because I love." Bukowski's rebellion is not always love. Sometimes it is a bitter, solitary howl against the world, yet both writers share the conviction that rebellion is an act of affirmation. Camus's absurd hero accepts the futility of existence but continues to create meaning through defiance. Bukowski's defiance takes the form of writing dirty, unfiltered poetry, of refusing to sanitize his experience for the sake of polite society. Both see the act of creation as a way to confront the void, to give shape to an otherwise shapeless reality. Nietzsche's Will to Power provides another lens. Nietzsche posits that all life strives to assert itself, to overcome, to become more than its circumstances. Bukowski's life, riddled with poverty, alcoholism, and rejection, can be read as a relentless assertion of his own narrative. He does not wait for external validation. He writes for himself, for the moment, for the fleeting spark of truth. In The Laughing Heart, the line, "You have to die a little each day," echoes Nietzsche's call to become who you are, to constantly shed the layers that society imposes. The dying is a metaphor for shedding conformity, for embracing the raw self that Nietzsche would celebrate as the higher individual. Stoic thought, particularly the concept of amor fati, offers a complementary perspective. The Stoics taught that we should love our fate, that acceptance is not passive resignation but active engagement. Bukowski's acceptance of his own decline, his acceptance of the ugly truth, mirrors the Stoic attitude. In The Laughing Heart, he writes, "You're the only thing you can trust / so you'll have to trust yourself." The trust is not in a deity or in an external moral order, but in the self, in the acceptance of whatever the world throws at you. This Stoic acceptance, however, is colored by a nihilistic hue. Bukowski does not see fate as a path to virtue, but as a canvas for raw expression. Now, let us return to the textual analysis of the paradox of freedom through self-destruction. In the poem The Shoelace, the act of cutting the shoelace can be read as a symbolic severance of the social contract, the expectations that bind us to conventional life. When the shoelace snaps, the individual falls, but the fall is also a liberation. The poem's final line, "The ground is softer than the sky," suggests that the descent, though painful, is gentler than the weight of expectation. In factotum, Chinaski's decision to abandon his job at the post office is not a simple act of quitting. It is a deliberate plunge into uncertainty. He writes, "I left the post office because I was tired of watching the world move in a straight line while I was stuck in a loop." This statement encapsulates the paradox. By destroying the stability of his employment, he gains a freedom that is otherwise inaccessible. He becomes a wanderer, a drifter, but also an author of his own narrative. The philosophical resonance of this paradox can be found in the Buddhist concept of sunyata, emptiness. In Buddhist thought, recognizing emptiness is not a nihilistic void but a gateway to liberation, because it removes the attachment to a fixed self. Bukowski's self-destruction functions similarly. By dismantling the self that society constructs, he reveals an emptiness that can be filled with authentic experience. The difference lies in the tone. Bukowski's emptiness is gritty, profane, and grounded in the material world, while Buddhist emptiness is often described in serene, meditative language. Yet both point toward the same insight that freedom emerges when we let go of the illusion of permanence. Let us also consider the modern interpretations of Bukowski's themes in contemporary culture. In the age of social media, where curated images of perfection dominate, Bukowski's celebration of the mundane feels revolutionary. Influencers who post flawless brunches and perfectly lit sunsets are, in a sense, the antithesis of Bukowski's ugly truth. Yet a new wave of writers, often called post-grunge poets, draw directly from Bukowski's aesthetic, using Twitter threads to share raw, unfiltered observations of daily life. A broken elevator, a late-night coffee spill, a conversation with a barista who is still dreaming about a better life. These modern poets echo Bukowski's insistence that the ordinary is worthy of attention, that the ugly truth is not a flaw but a feature of authentic existence. Similarly, the paradox of freedom through self-destruction finds echo in the contemporary discourse around digital detox and radical self-care. Some activists argue that abandoning social media, rejecting consumerist pressures, and even embracing minimalism are forms of self-destruction that lead to greater freedom. While Bukowski's self-destruction was often self-inflicted through substance abuse, the underlying principle, that breaking away from the expectations of the dominant culture can open new avenues of autonomy, remains relevant. The modern digital monk who gives up the smartphone to experience the world directly can be seen as a contemporary embodiment of Bukowski's philosophy, albeit with a healthier twist. We must also examine the counterargument that Bukowski's nihilism is escapism. Critics such as literary theorist Michael Larkin argue Bukowski's endless focus on personal decay distracts from the possibility of collective action. By immersing himself in a self-absorbed spiral, he offers readers a model of withdrawal rather than engagement. The rebuttal, however, points to Bukowski's own acknowledgement that personal honesty can be a catalyst for broader empathy. By laying bare his own flaws, he invites readers to confront theirs, fostering a kind of radical self-awareness that can precede social awareness. In The Laughing Heart, the line, "You are the only thing you can trust," can be interpreted not as isolation, but as a call to authenticity, which, when multiplied across individuals, can create a more honest society. The feminist critique, too, can be met with nuance. While Bukowski's language is undeniably raw and often misogynistic in tone, some scholars argue that his work functions as a mirror reflecting the toxic masculinity of his era rather than endorsing it. In an essay titled "Mirror of the Marginal Man," Professor Anita Rao writes, Bukowski's depictions of women are not celebrations of misogyny, they are unflinching portrayals of a man who is himself trapped in a patriarchal narrative. By exposing his own shortcomings, Bukowski forces readers to question the cultural scripts that produce such attitudes. Nevertheless, the critique remains vital. Representation matters, and the repeated use of demeaning language can perpetuate harmful norms, regardless of authorial intent. To deepen our understanding, let us draw a line from Bukowski to the existentialist tradition beyond Camus. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Existence precedes essence." Bukowski lives this axiom. His existence, marked by work, drink, love, loss, precedes any essential meaning. He does not wait for a grand purpose to appear. He creates meaning in the act of living itself. In Factotum, when Chinaski reflects on his own insignificance, he says, "I'm a man who knows nothing and knows that he knows nothing." This self-awareness of ignorance mirrors Sartre's notion that consciousness is always aware of its own lack of predetermined essence. Bukowski's poems become acts of existential affirmation. By acknowledging the void, he refuses to be paralyzed by it. We can also reference the ancient Greek concept of ataraxia, a state of serene calmness achieved by freeing oneself from unnecessary desire. Bukowski's disdain for material ambition and his acceptance of a life of scarcity can be seen as a twisted form of ataraxia. He does not seek peace through detachment. He finds it through embracing the chaos of his desires, drinking, writing, fighting. Yet in moments of quiet, such as the night he sits on a rooftop in Los Angeles, watching the city lights flicker, he experiences a fleeting ataraxia, a calm that arises not from the absence of desire but from the surrender to the present moment. Another historical anecdote enriches our portrait of Bukowski's philosophy. In 1975, during a reading at a small coffee house in San Francisco, a young poet named Lisa approached him after the session. She asked, "Do you ever think about hope?" Bukowski stared at his coffee, swirled the dark liquid, and replied, "Hope is a cigarette that burns your fingers before you even light it." The metaphor captures his view that hope, like many human aspirations, is inherently self-defeating, a brief flare that leaves a lingering ache. Yet the very act of speaking about hope, of acknowledging it, suggests that even in his nihilism, there is room for a kind of compassionate awareness, a recognition that others, too, clutch at fragile embers. In the broader literary landscape, Bukowski's work has inspired a lineage of writers who adopt his gritty realism. Charles Simic, in a 1990 interview, described Bukowski as the poet who taught us that the trash can is a holy shrine. Simic's own poems about garbage trucks and city alleys echo Bukowski's reverence for the overlooked. Meanwhile, contemporary author Charles D'Ambrosio writes, "When I read Bukowski, I hear the echo of a man who refused to be silenced by the polite world." These testimonies illustrate how Bukowski's celebration of the mundane has become a touchstone for writers seeking authenticity in an age of artifice. The paradox of freedom through self-destruction also finds resonance in modern psychological theory. The concept of post-traumatic growth suggests that individuals can experience positive psychological change following adversity. Bukowski's self-destruction, his bouts with alcoholism, his reckless relationships, can be read as a form of self-inflicted trauma that paradoxically fuels creative growth. In Factotum, after a night of binge drinking, Chinaski wakes up with a hangover and a fresh manuscript, as if the pain itself has birthed new art. This aligns with the idea that confronting the darkest parts of ourselves can lead to a deeper, more resilient sense of self, echoing the ancient Stoic belief that adversity is the forge of virtue. We should also examine how Bukowski's themes intersect with contemporary discussions of mental health. His candid depictions of depression, addiction, and existential dread predate the modern discourse on these topics. In The Laughing Heart, the line, "You have to die a little each day," can be interpreted as an early articulation of the need for daily emotional processing, a form of psychological hygiene. Modern therapists might view Bukowski's relentless honesty as a therapeutic model. By naming the pain, by refusing to mask it with platitudes, he models a form of radical acceptance that can be healing. Yet critics caution that glorifying self-destruction without offering pathways to recovery can be dangerous, especially for vulnerable readers. This tension underscores the responsibility of interpreting Bukowski's work in a nuanced way, acknowledging both its artistic power and its potential impact on mental health. In drawing all these threads together, we see that Bukowski's core philosophical themes, celebrating the mundane, nihilistic compassion and freedom through self-destruction, are not isolated ideas but an intricate web that connects to a broad spectrum of philosophical thought. Camus's absurdism provides the scaffolding for the celebration of the ordinary. Nietzsche's will to power underwrites the compassionate rebellion against suffering. Stoic acceptance and Buddhist emptiness illuminate the paradox of self-destruction as a gateway to freedom. The counterarguments, from accusations of escapism to feminist critiques, force us to interrogate the ethical dimensions of his work, reminding us that philosophy is never merely abstract but always lived. As we reflect on Bukowski's legacy, let us remember his own words from a 1978 interview. "I write because I have to, because the world won't give me a reason, and because the only thing I can trust is the ink on the page." Those ink-stained pages continue to echo across generations, inviting us to sit with the ugly truth, to feel the sting of nihilism while extending a hand of compassion, and to consider whether the greatest freedom lies not in preserving ourselves, but in daring to dismantle the very structures that bind us. In the end, Bukowski asks us to listen to the quiet roar of everyday life, to recognize that within the grime and the brokenness, there is a pulse that beats with the same stubborn resilience as any grand philosophical system. And perhaps in that recognition, we find the space to write our own verses, to cut our own shoelaces, and to step into the rain, fully aware that the ground beneath us may be hard, but the act of stepping is in itself an affirmation of being. When we turn our attention to Charles Bukowski, we are drawn into a world that refuses the comforting veneer of polite society. He does not whisper about virtue in the language of lofty ideals. He shouts it in the raw, unvarnished tone of a man who has lived on the margins, who has stared at the gutter and seen his own reflection staring back. This is the heart of what we might call Bukowski's ethics of authenticity, a moral philosophy that prizes raw honesty over the polished pretenses that dominate much of our cultural conversation. In this segment, we will walk through the origins of that ethic, trace its development through his poems and life, examine the arguments that support it, confront the counter-arguments that accuse it of self-indulgence or moral danger, and finally see how his ideas echo the thoughts of Heidegger, Sartre, and contemporary existential psychology. All of this will be illustrated with concrete examples, historical anecdotes, and the occasional line of poetry that captures the essence of Bukowski's art of living. let us begin with the notion of living like a dog, a phrase that Bukowski himself used to describe the kind of existence he advocated. In his poem Love is a Dog from Hell, he writes, "The dog is loyal, the dog is faithful, the dog will never betray you." Yet the same poem also warns, the dog will also bite you, will also bark at strangers, will also have to die. The image of the dog is not a sentimental one. It is an animal driven by instinct, unburdened by the social scripts that humans have built around themselves. To live like a dog for Bukowski means to follow the inner compass of desire, pain, and survival, without the constant need to smooth over the rough edges for the sake of acceptance. It is a call to embrace the animal within, to recognize that the human condition is not a polished veneer, but a messy, often filthy, reality. This ethic is rooted in Bukowski's own biography. He grew up in Los Angeles during the Great Depression, a city that was simultaneously a promise of Hollywood glamour and a sprawling landscape of broken dreams. His father was an alcoholic, his mother a hard-working immigrant who struggled to keep the household afloat. Bukowski left school at the age of 14, worked a series of menial jobs, most famously as a postal worker for 24 years, and spent his evenings drinking in dive bars, writing in cheap notebooks, and observing the people who inhabited the same dimly lit corners. The rawness of his life experience gave him a unique perspective on authenticity. He saw the gap between the glossy narratives sold by the media and the lived reality of the working class. In his own words, "I'm not a poet because I'm a poet because I have to be." That simple statement encapsulates his belief that authenticity is not a choice but a necessity, a survival mechanism in a world that demands conformity. The poem The Genius of the Crowd offers a stark illustration of this stance. Bukowski opens with a blunt observation. The crowd is a dog that will never be satisfied. He goes on to describe how the masses cling to conformity, how they chew on the same old ideas, swallow the same old lies. The poem's refrain, "The genius of the crowd is that it will never let you be a genius," is a rallying cry for individual honesty. It is not an abstract philosophical treatise. It is a visceral condemnation of the social pressure to hide one's true self behind a mask of politeness. Bukowski's language is deliberately unrefined, his metaphors gritty, because he wants the reader to feel the weight of the crowd's expectations as a physical pressure, like the weight of a concrete slab on the chest. In doing so, he forces us to confront the choice, to surrender to the crowd's safety or to stand alone, raw and exposed. Contrast this with Love is a Dog from Hell, where he writes, "The only thing you can trust in this world is that you will die, and that love will be the thing that makes you die." The poem's central metaphor, Love as a Dog, suggests that love, like a dog, is honest, unpretentious, and often brutal. It does not hide behind polite niceties. It bites, it licks, it demands attention. By equating love with a creature that lives in the moment, Bukowski is reinforcing his broader ethical claim. That authenticity requires embracing the full spectrum of experience, even the painful, even the animalistic. He is not advocating for a life of reckless hedonism. Rather, he is urging us to acknowledge that the human heart, like a dog's, is driven by instinctual needs that cannot be fully tamed by social etiquette. Now, let us consider two pivotal historical moments that illuminate how Bukowski's authenticity intersected with broader cultural and legal battles. The first is the 1980 lawsuit over his poem, The Laughing Heart. While many remember Bukowski as a poet who thrived on the fringes, this episode thrust him into the courtroom, challenging the limits of artistic freedom. In 1980, a small publishing house printed a limited edition of The Laughing Heart, a poem that contains the lines, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into the mold / of what you think you should be." A local community group, offended by the poem's blunt encouragement to reject conformity, sued the publisher for obscenity and incitement to social disorder. The case became a flashpoint for the debate over whether raw, unfiltered expression could be censored in the name of public morality. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the publisher, citing the First Amendment and emphasizing that Bukowski's poem, though unrefined, was a legitimate exercise of free speech. The decision reinforced the idea that authenticity, even when it is uncomfortable, is protected under the law. It also underscored Bukowski's belief that the artist must be free to present the truth as he sees it, without being forced into a sanitized version that would appease the majority. The second anecdote involves Bukowski's friendship with John Fante, a writer whose influence on Bukowski's ethical stance cannot be overstated. Fante, an Italian-American novelist who died in 1983, was known for his gritty portrayals of working-class life in Los Angeles, especially in works like Ask the Dust. Bukowski discovered Fante's work in the early 1960s and was immediately drawn to its unflinching honesty. He famously called Fonte the only writer who ever wrote about the real Lowe's Angels, the one that smells of oil and cheap coffee. Their friendship blossomed through letters, occasional meetings in smoky bars, and a mutual respect for each other's willingness to expose the underbelly of existence. Bukowski once wrote to Fonte, "Your words are like a punch in the gut that wakes me up, and I want to be that punch for others." Fonte's influence reinforced Bukowski's conviction that the writer's moral duty is to present life as it is, not as it should be. Fonte's own ethical stance, rooted in a kind of rugged compassion for the downtrodden, provided Bukowski with a model of how authenticity could be coupled with empathy. This relationship illustrates that Bukowski's philosophy was not developed in isolation. It was part of a lineage of American writers who chose truth over comfort. Having established the foundations of Bukowski's ethics, we now turn to the philosophical arguments that support his emphasis on raw honesty. One central claim is that authenticity is a form of moral integrity. By refusing to hide behind socially acceptable facades, the individual maintains a consistent alignment between inner desire and outward action. This alignment, according to Bukowski, prevents the kind of self-deception that leads to existential emptiness. In The Genius of the Crowd, he writes, "The truth is a lonely thing, but it is the only thing that keeps you alive." The argument here is that truth, however uncomfortable, is a life-sustaining force. It is akin to the ancient Stoic idea that living in accordance with nature is the highest good. Bukowski's nature is not the serene, rational order of the cosmos, but the gritty, animalistic reality of human desire and suffering. By confronting that reality head-on, the individual avoids the internal rot that comes from living a lie. A second argument draws on the existentialist tradition, particularly the notion of authenticity as articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre famously claimed that existence precedes essence, meaning that we are not born with a predetermined nature, we must create ourselves through choices. However, Sartre also warned that we often flee from this responsibility by adopting bad faith, a self-deception that allows us to hide behind social roles. Bukowski's Living Like a Dog can be read as a radical rejection of bad faith. The dog, unlike a human constrained by societal expectations, simply acts according to its instincts. By encouraging us to adopt the dog's straightforwardness, Bukowski is urging us to abandon bad faith and embrace the freedom and the terror of making authentic choices. In this sense, Bukowski's ethic aligns with Sartre's call for individuals to own their freedom, even when that freedom leads them into the alleyways of addiction, poverty, or loneliness. A third line of support comes from contemporary existential psychology, a field that merges existential philosophy with clinical practice. Scholars such as Irvin Yalom argue that self-acceptance, embracing one's flaws, fears, and desires, is essential for psychological health. Yalom writes, "When we accept the reality of who we are, we can begin to live with meaning, even in the face of suffering." Bukowski's poetry can be seen as a literary embodiment of this therapeutic principle. His candid admissions of alcoholism, sexual frustration, and creative struggle mirror the therapeutic process of confronting one's shadow. By presenting his own life as a case study, Bukowski invites readers to see their own shadows reflected in his verses, thereby normalizing the experience of inner conflict and encouraging self-acceptance. The ethical dimension here is that authenticity becomes a pathway to mental well-being, not merely a rebellious stance. Now, we must address the two major counter-arguments that critics often raise against Bukowski's brand of authenticity. The first claim is that his raw honesty merely masks self-indulgence. Critics point to his frequent references to drinking, sex, and violence, suggesting that these are not moral statements but excuses for personal excess. They argue that by glorifying his own vices, Bukowski is using authenticity as a shield for narcissism. To respond, we can look closely at the tone of his poems. In The Laughing Heart, the line, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into the mold / of what you think you should be," is not a celebration of self-destructive behavior. It is an invitation to own one's circumstances, however bleak. Moreover, Bukowski's self-portrayal is often accompanied by a sense of regret and self-critique. In Bluebird, he writes, "There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out / but I'm too tough for it, I push it down." The bluebird is a metaphor for tenderness that he actively suppresses. This admission reveals an internal conflict. He is aware of the harm his lifestyle causes, yet he chooses to live on his own terms. The authenticity, then, is not a cover for indulgence, but an honest acknowledgement of the tension between desire and responsibility. By exposing his own contradictions, Bukowski forces readers to confront the possibility that authenticity can coexist with self-awareness and even self-critique. The second counter-argument asserts that Bukowski's lifestyle glorifies harmful behavior, potentially encouraging readers to emulate his destructive habits. The concern is that by presenting alcoholism, promiscuity, and a disdain for social norms as heroic, he normalizes these as viable paths to fulfillment. To engage this critique, we must differentiate between description and prescription. Bukowski's poems often describe his own excesses, but they rarely prescribe them as the only route to authenticity. In The Genius of the Crowd, he warns that the crowd will never let you be a genius, and then adds, "But the genius is a lonely man, a man who lives in his own head, a man who drinks and writes and dies alone." The loneliness and eventual death are presented as inevitable consequences, not as rewards. Additionally, Bukowski's own life ended relatively quietly. He did not achieve fame through a glamorous lifestyle, but rather through relentless, often painful, writing. His authenticity was a hard-won, hard-lived philosophy that demanded personal sacrifice. The ethical lesson, therefore, is not that one should imitate his vices, but that one should confront them honestly, acknowledging both the allure and the cost. This perspective aligns with Heidegger's notion of being toward death, which we will explore shortly. Heidegger's concept of being toward death provides a profound philosophical backdrop for Bukowski's ethics. Heidegger argues that authentic existence arises when an individual confronts the inevitability of death, thereby breaking free from the impersonal crowd that dictates norms. In Being and Time, Heidegger writes that the most authentic way of being is to own one's finitude. Bukowski's poetry often circles around mortality in a stark, unembellished manner. In The Laughing Heart, he urges the reader to "You have to die, so you might as well die with your eyes open." By facing death directly, Bukowski encourages a form of living that is unmediated by the expectations of others. The dog metaphor fits neatly into this Heideggerian framework. A dog does not deny its mortality. It lives in the present, aware of its limited time, and therefore acts without pretense. Bukowski's call to live like a dog can be read as an invitation to embrace our finitude, to let the fear of death strip away the superfluous layers of social performance, and to act in accordance with our true, instinctual selves. Sartre's notion of authenticity also resonates strongly with Bukowski's stance. Sartre famously warned that man is condemned to be free. Freedom, for Sartre, is both a gift and a burden. It forces us to make choices that define us, and we cannot escape the responsibility of those choices. In Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre states, we are our choices. Bukowski's poems repeatedly stress the importance of making choices that are true to one's inner drive, regardless of external judgment. When he writes, "I'm not a man who wants to be a poet, I'm a poet who wants to be a man," he flips the expectation that the poet must first conform to societal norms before pursuing art. Instead, he claims that the poet's identity is primary and any social role is secondary. This inversion reflects Sartre's claim that we must define ourselves first, then negotiate with the world. Bukowski's raw honesty is thus an existential act of self-definition, an assertion that his being is not contingent upon the crowd's approval. Modern existential psychology further bridges the gap between philosophy and lived experience. Researchers such as Rollo may have argued that authenticity is essential for psychological health, but that it requires a courageous confrontation with the self. May writes, "The only way to find out who you are is to be willing to risk the loss of the self that you think you are." Bukowski's life is a testament to that risk. He risked financial stability, social acceptance, and even his own health to pursue a writing career that was unfiltered and unapologetic. The psychological cost was high, but the reward, according to Bukowski, was a sense of being truly alive. In The Laughing Heart, the line "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into the mold" can be interpreted as an invitation to undergo the painful process of self-discovery, a process that existential psychology describes as essential for authentic living. To further illuminate Bukowski's ethical framework, let us explore two concrete examples from his body of work that demonstrate how he applies his philosophy to everyday situations. The first example comes from the poem The Shoelace. In this brief piece, Bukowski describes a mundane act. "I tie my shoes, the knot is a rope, the rope is a life." The knot becomes a metaphor for the choices we make that bind us to a particular path. He continues, "If you let the rope slip, you fall. If you tighten it, you walk." Here, the simple act of tying a shoelace is elevated to an ethical decision. Do we tighten the knot of our own desires, accepting the consequences, or do we let it loosen and fall into the crowd's complacency? The poem's stark language underscores that authenticity is not reserved for grand, heroic moments. It is present in the smallest, most ordinary actions. By paying attention to the everyday, Bukowski forces us to consider that living authentically is a continuous practice, not a one-off rebellion. A second illustrative example is found in his prose work Factotum, a semi-autobiographical novel that follows Henry Chinaski, Bukowski's alter ego, through a series of menial jobs. In one chapter, Chinaski works as a dishwasher at a cheap restaurant, and he describes the experience with brutal clarity. The plates clatter like 1,000 tiny bones breaking. The water is hot enough to burn the skin off my fingers, but the boss says, "Work faster, you're a dog." The boss's insult, calling him a dog, mirrors Bukowski's own reclamation of the term. Rather than feeling dehumanized, Chinaski embraces the label, seeing it as a badge of authenticity. He writes, "I am a dog, I eat, I sleep, I work, I love. I do not pretend to be anything else." This passage demonstrates how Bukowski transforms an oppressive social label into an affirmation of his ethical stance. By embracing the dog's identity, he refuses the boss's attempt to reduce him to a cog in the machine, instead asserting his own agency and truth. Analogies also help to clarify Bukowski's position. Imagine a piece of raw, unpolished wood that a carpenter decides to leave in its natural state, rather than sand it down to fit a sleek, modern design. The wood retains its knots, its grain, its imperfections, and in doing so, it tells a story of the forest it came from. Bukowski's poetry is that raw wood. He refuses to sand away the knots of his life, his alcoholism, his failed relationships, his poverty, because those knots are essential to the story he wants to tell. To sand them away would be to erase his authenticity, to produce a work that looks smooth but is devoid of the lived experience that gives it meaning. This analogy illustrates why, for Bukowski, authenticity is not a decorative flourish but the very substance of his art. Historical anecdotes further enrich our understanding of how Bukowski's ethic played out in real life. The 1980 lawsuit over The Laughing Heart, as mentioned earlier, was not merely a legal battle. It was a cultural clash between the rising tide of conservative moralism and the countercultural insistence on artistic freedom. The community group that sued the publisher was composed of local church leaders who believed that Bukowski's encouragement to die with your eyes open was a direct affront to religious teachings about hope and redemption. In the courtroom, the judge quoted Thomas Jefferson, "The whole purpose of the establishment of a free press is that it may be the servant of the people, not the master." By ruling in favor of Bukowski's publisher, the court affirmed that raw honesty, no matter how uncomfortable, has a protected place in public discourse. This outcome reinforced Bukowski's conviction that authenticity is a public good, a necessary counterweight to the homogenizing forces of the crowd. The second anecdote, Bukowski's friendship with John Fonte, provides a more intimate glimpse into how personal relationships can shape ethical outlooks. When Bukowski first read Fonte's novel, Ask the Dust, he was struck by the protagonist's relentless pursuit of his own artistic voice despite poverty and rejection. Bukowski later wrote, "I read Fonte and I felt a hand on my shoulder, a man saying, 'You're not alone.'" Their correspondence reveals a mutual admiration for each other's refusal to compromise. In a letter dated March 1975, Fonte wrote, "Your poems are like a street lamp in a dark alley. They do not pretend to be anything but what they are, light that cuts through the night." Bukowski responded, "And your stories are like the smell of coffee in a cheap diner, real, bitter, and impossible to ignore." This exchange underscores how both writers saw authenticity as a moral imperative, a way of bearing witness to the lives of those who exist on society's margins. Their friendship cemented Bukowski's belief that honesty, even when it reveals ugliness, is a form of ethical solidarity with the oppressed. Returning to the philosophical cross-references, we can see how Bukowski's ethic resonates with, yet diverges from, other thinkers. Heidegger's Being Toward Death emphasizes that authenticity arises when we accept our finitude, but Heidegger also warns against the they-self that distracts us from this confrontation. Bukowski's poetry can be read as a continuous reminder that the they-self is the crowd that demands conformity. In The Genius of the Crowd, he writes, "The crowd is a dog that will never be satisfied." This line mirrors Heidegger's critique of the impersonal they that lulls us into inauthentic existence. However, where Heidegger's solution is often abstract, urging a turn inward through philosophical contemplation, Bukowski offers a concrete, bodily practice: drink, write, love, and accept the animal within. The two approaches complement each other. Heidegger provides the existential framework, while Bukowski supplies the visceral, lived expression of that framework. Sartre's authenticity, on the other hand, is rooted in the notion of freedom as responsibility. Sartre insists that we cannot hide behind excuses, we must own our choices. Bukowski's declaration that "I'm not a poet because I'm a poet because I have to be," aligns with Sartre's insistence that we must act in accordance with our own essence, not the roles imposed upon us. Yet Sartre also warns that freedom can lead to anguish, a feeling that Bukowski seems to relish. In The Laughing Heart, the line "you have to die, so you might as well die with your eyes open" captures a kind of existential anguish that is both terrifying and liberating. Sartre would likely view Bukowski's embrace of that anguish as an authentic affirmation of freedom. Modern existential psychology adds a therapeutic dimension to this discussion. Irvin Yalom's concept of the ultimate concern, the need to find meaning in the face of mortality, dovetails with Bukowski's insistence on confronting death directly. Yalom writes, "When we accept death, we can live more fully." Bukowski's poems are in many ways a liturgical practice of that acceptance. The repeated motif of the dog, which lives in the present and does not linger on past regrets, serves as a metaphor for the therapeutic goal of staying present. By encouraging readers to stop worrying about the future and live now, Bukowski is, perhaps unintentionally, echoing modern mindfulness practices that aim to reduce anxiety by grounding the self in the present moment. To further illustrate the practical implications of Bukowski's ethics, consider the modern workplace. In a corporate environment that prizes polished presentations, networking, and a curated personal brand, Bukowski's call to live like a dog can feel radical, even subversive. Yet the underlying principle, being honest about one's capabilities, desires, and limits, can be transformative. An employee who admits without shame that they are not suited for a particular role or that they need time to process personal difficulties is exercising the same authenticity Bukowski championed. This honesty may initially be uncomfortable for managers and colleagues, but it can lead to more genuine collaborations, reduced burnout, and a workplace culture that values truth over performance metrics. In this way, Bukowski's ethic extends beyond poetry. It offers a blueprint for ethical behavior in institutions that often demand conformity. Another contemporary application can be found in the realm of social media. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok reward curated perfection, encouraging users to present a filtered version of themselves. Bukowski's admonition against the crowd becomes a warning against the digital crowd that shapes our self-presentation. By posting an unedited photograph, by writing a caption that admits to a bad day, or by refusing to engage in the endless cycle of likes and comments, a user practices a form of digital authenticity that echoes Bukowski's raw honesty. This act of resistance can be a powerful statement that our value does not lie in the number of hearts we collect, but in the sincerity of our lived experience. The modern dog is the user who scrolls past the glossy feeds and shares a poem about a broken heart, a night spent in a cheap motel, or the simple pleasure of a cold beer after a long shift. The act of sharing such unvarnished moments becomes an ethical stance, a refusal to let the digital crowd dictate one's self-image. In addressing the criticism that Bukowski's authenticity can be a mask for self-indulgence, we might also consider the concept of self-deception in psychoanalytic theory. Freud distinguished between repression and sublimation. Repression hides unwanted impulses, while sublimation transforms them into socially acceptable outlets. Bukowski appears to reject both. He does not repress his impulses, nor does he attempt to channel them into socially sanctioned forms. Instead, he presents them directly, often in a raw, unfiltered manner. This directness can be unsettling, but it also prevents the psychic split that leads to inner conflict. By refusing to hide behind a socially acceptable facade, Bukowski minimizes the space where self-deception can thrive. The risk, of course, is that the rawness can become an excuse for excess, but the poet's own self-critical moments, such as the bluebird metaphor, show that he is aware of the delicate balance. The authenticity he offers is thus a call for readers to monitor their own self-deception, to ask whether they are using raw honesty as a shield for ego or as a genuine path towards self-knowledge. The second criticism, that his lifestyle glorifies harmful behavior, can be examined through the lens of moral philosophy, specifically the distinction between descriptive ethics and normative ethics. Bukowski's poetry is largely descriptive. It describes how he lives, how he feels, how he perceives the world. It does not, in most cases, prescribe a moral rule that everyone must follow. When he writes, "The only thing you can trust in this world is that you will die," he is not telling the reader to adopt a nihilistic worldview, but rather to recognize an undeniable fact. The normative leap, if any, comes when readers interpret his descriptions as endorsements. The responsibility for that leap lies with the reader, not with the poet. In this sense, Bukowski's work can be viewed as a mirror, reflecting the darker aspects of human life while leaving the moral judgment to the observer. This mirrors the ancient Greek concept of mimesis, where art imitates life, and it is through that imitation that society can examine its own values. Bukowski's unflinching depictions of alcoholism, for instance, can prompt readers to consider the societal conditions that lead to such coping mechanisms, rather than simply glorifying them. To bring these threads together, let us consider a final analogy that synthesizes Bukowski's ethic with the philosophical foundations we have discussed. Imagine a river flowing through a canyon. The river cannot control the shape of the canyon. The canyon shapes the river's path, yet the river can choose whether to flow smoothly over the surface or to carve new channels, to break through rocks, to create waterfalls. Bukowski's authenticity is the river's decision to carve its own path, even when it leads to turbulence, even when it creates dangerous rapids. Heidegger's being toward death is the canyon's awareness that it will eventually erode away, reminding the river that its time is limited. Sartre's freedom is the river's capacity to choose its direction, even when that choice entails risk. Existential psychology's self-acceptance is the river's recognition of its own currents, its eddies, its depth. The dog metaphor is the river's willingness to flow instinctively, without pretending to be a still lake. When we watch the river, we see a living illustration of how authenticity, responsibility, and mortality intertwine. In closing, Bukowski's ethics of authenticity is not a simplistic celebration of rebellion for its own sake. It is a complex, often painful philosophical stance that demands we confront the animal within, accept our mortality, and act in accordance with our true desires, even when those desires clash with social expectations. His poetry, From the Genius of the Crowd to Love is a Dog from Hell, offers vivid, concrete illustrations of this ethic, while historical episodes, like the 1980 lawsuit over the Laughing Heart and his friendship with John Fonte, show how his ideas played out in the public sphere and in intimate relationships. Counter-arguments that label his authenticity as self-indulgent or harmful can be met with careful textual analysis, philosophical nuance, and an understanding of the distinction between describing a life and prescribing one. By cross-referencing Heidegger's being toward death, Sartre's authenticity, and modern existential psychology's emphasis on self-acceptance, we see that Bukowski's raw honesty is part of a broader philosophical conversation about what it means to live an authentic life. Whether we are a poet, a corporate employee, or a social media user, the challenge remains the same: to strip away the pretense, to tie the knot of our own desires tightly, and to walk forward, perhaps with a dog at our side, into the inevitable unknown, eyes open, heart exposed, and spirit unafraid. When we think of poetry that rises from the gutter, that whispers from cracked sidewalks and flickering neon signs, Charles Bukowski often arrives in our minds as the lone, unvarnished voice of the marginal. Yet his work does more than simply catalog the bruises of the working class, the homeless, the alcoholic. It builds a quiet, relentless critique of a society that consigns those lives to the periphery, while simultaneously offering a space where those forgotten figures can speak their own names. In this segment, we will walk through the way Bukowski gives voice to the marginalized. Examine two of his most telling pieces, the short story, The Most Beautiful Woman in Town, and the poem, Alone with Everybody, and situate his social commentary within a broader literary and philosophical tradition that stretches from John Steinbeck's social realism to Levinas's ethics of the other, and reaches into today's conversations about street philosophy. Along the way, we will hear the echoes of his own life, the anecdote of his 1975 reading in a Los Angeles homeless shelter, and the sting of his 1979 rejection from The New Yorker. We will also confront the criticisms that accuse him of romanticizing poverty, and the Marxist charge that his work stops at observation without proposing systemic change. By the end, you may find that Bukowski's politics are not shouted from a podium, but whispered from a barstool, and that whisper carries a weight that reverberates far beyond the cheap paper on which it is printed. Let us begin with the short story, The Most Beautiful Woman in Town. On its surface, the piece follows a nameless narrator, a drifter who spends his evenings at a dimly lit bar, watching a woman who, according to the narrator, is the most beautiful woman in town. The description is not a celebration of conventional glamour. Rather, it is a stark, almost clinical observation. He writes, she had a face that looked like it had been carved out of a cheap plaster cast, but her eyes held a kind of tired kindness that made you think she had lived 1,000 lives. The story's power lies in the juxtaposition of that beauty with the squalor surrounding her, the cracked linoleum, the stale beer, the flickering fluorescent light that never quite reaches the corner where she stands. Bukowski does not romanticize the scene. He does not dress it in lyrical roses. Instead, he lets the reader feel the grit of the environment, the smell of sweat and cheap perfume, the hum of a jukebox that never quite finishes a song. In doing so, he forces us to confront the reality that beauty can exist in the most neglected corners of a city, and that the people who inhabit those corners are not mere background props, but carriers of a profound, if painful, humanity. The narrative structure of the story mirrors the marginal existence it portrays. It is episodic, lacking a traditional climax, much like the day-to-day of a person living on the edge. The narrator's voice is raw, unfiltered, and yet it carries an empathy that is rarely found in mainstream portrayals of the working poor. He does not moralize, he does not preach. He simply observes, and through that observation, he asks us, what does it mean to be most beautiful when the world has already decided that you are invisible? The story becomes a quiet indictment of a society that measures worth by productivity, by the ability to conform to a polished middle-class ideal, and discards anyone who cannot fit that mold. Bukowski's narrator, in his unassuming tone, reminds us that beauty is not a market price. It is a scar that you carry with you, and sometimes you wear it like a badge, sometimes you hide it under a coat. That line, though simple, reverberates with the same ethical urgency that Emmanuel Levinas would later articulate when he spoke of the face of the other demanding responsibility. In Bukowski's barroom, the other is the woman, the drifter, the bartender, each a face that calls out for recognition, for a gaze that does not reduce them to a statistic. Turning now to the poem Alone with Everybody, we encounter a different texture of Bukowski's social critique, one that is more internal, more introspective, yet still rooted in the external conditions of marginality. The poem opens with a stark confession: the flesh covers the bone / and the bone covers the meat. From the very first line, Bukowski collapses the hierarchy that separates body from soul, rich from poor, making the human condition a single, bruised continuum. He continues, I'm a man who has never been able to keep his mouth shut about the things that bother me. The poem's refrain, alone, all alone / with everybody / and everything, captures the paradox of being surrounded by humanity while feeling utterly isolated. Here the everybody is not a crowd of affluent patrons, but the collective of drunks, night shift workers, and street corner philosophers who share the same night sky, the same flickering streetlights. The poem's rhythm, short, jagged lines punctuated by long, breathless stretches, mimics the halting speech of someone who has been forced to speak his truth in noisy, indifferent rooms. In the third stanza, Bukowski writes, I am a lonely man / but I am not alone / because I am surrounded by a sea of people who are also lonely. This line is both an observation and a subtle indictment. It suggests that loneliness is not a personal failing but a structural condition, one that arises when society fails to provide the connective tissue of community, when the market forces that dictate value leave entire classes of people stranded on the margins. The poem does not offer a solution, it does not propose a revolution, yet it does something equally potent. It names the problem, and in naming it, it forces the listener to acknowledge the existence of that problem. As Levinas would argue, the ethical demand arises when we encounter the face of the other, in Bukowski's case, the faces of the lonely, the drunks, the homeless, and we are called to respond. Bukowski's poetic voice becomes a conduit for that call, a low-key alarm bell that rings in the ears of anyone willing to listen. Now, let us step out of the page and into the world that shaped these words. In the winter of 1975, Bukowski accepted an invitation to read his work at a homeless shelter in downtown Los Angeles. The shelter was a concrete slab, its walls plastered with flyers for soup kitchens and job placement services. The audience was a mixture of men who had been on the streets for years, women who clutched thin blankets, and a handful of social workers who looked on with a mixture of curiosity and professional detachment. Bukowski arrived, a bottle of cheap whiskey in his coat pocket, his beard unshaven, his eyes still rimmed with the red of sleepless nights. He stood on a makeshift stage, a wooden crate, and began to read. The first line he uttered was from Alone with Everybody, his voice low, almost a whisper, the flesh covers the bone and the bone covers the meat. The room fell silent, not because of reverence, but because the words seemed to echo the very walls that had witnessed so much suffering. As he read, his voice grew steadier, and he slipped into the most beautiful woman in town, describing the cracked linoleum and the flickering neon. The homeless listeners, many of whom had been ignored by the literary elite, nodded, some with tears, some with a brief smile that seemed to recognize their own stories reflected back at them. After the reading, Bukowski lingered, sharing a bottle of cheap whiskey with a man named Carlos, who told him about his days working in a warehouse, his dreams of becoming a carpenter, and his frustration with a system that offered him only menial labor. Bukowski listened, and in that moment the boundary between writer and audience dissolved. The anecdote of that night is not just a footnote. It is a living illustration of Bukowski's commitment to being present among the people he wrote about, to letting his words land in the very spaces where those lives unfold. It also underscores his belief that literature can be a bridge, not a barrier, between the privileged and the marginalized. Contrast this moment of intimacy with the public rebuke Bukowski faced in 1979 when he submitted a manuscript to The New Yorker, a magazine that, at the time, represented the pinnacle of literary respectability. The editors, after a polite but firm rejection, wrote back, "We appreciate your submission, but your work does not align with the aesthetic we seek." Bukowski's response, penned in his characteristic bluntness, read, "I'm not trying to fit into your aesthetic. I'm trying to write about people who don't fit into anyone's aesthetic." The rejection became a rallying point for his supporters, who saw it as evidence that the literary establishment was unwilling to engage with the raw, unvarnished realities of the working class. The episode also highlights a crucial tension in Bukowski's career, his desire to be heard by the mainstream, even as his content remained stubbornly anti-establishment. It is a tension that mirrors the broader conflict between artistic authenticity and institutional acceptance, a conflict that has haunted many writers who choose to write for the margins. The New Yorker rejection, while a personal slight, also serves as a symbolic moment in the history of American literature, marking the moment when a voice from the streets was officially deemed too uncomfortable for the polished pages of a high-brow magazine. These two anecdotes, the 1975 reading and the 1979 rejection, illustrate the dual nature of Bukowski's social critique. On one hand, he places himself physically among the marginalized, sharing in their hardships, listening to their stories, and allowing his work to be a mirror for their lived experiences. On the other hand, he confronts the gatekeepers of literary power, refusing to compromise his vision to fit a sanitized mold. This duality is essential to understanding his politics, which are less about grand manifestos and more about the everyday act of bearing witness. Yet Bukowski's work has not escaped criticism. One of the most common accusations is that his portrayal of poverty and alcoholism romanticizes the very conditions he depicts. Critics point to passages where he describes the sweet smell of cheap whiskey or the soft glow of a street lamp on a rain-slicked alley as evidence that he finds aesthetic pleasure in suffering. They argue that such language can make the hardships of the working poor appear as a kind of bohemian allure, a lifestyle choice rather than a structural injustice. In response, Bukowski's defenders often quote his own words from the afterword of Post Office. "I'm not a poet of the poor, I'm a poet of the human condition, and the human condition includes poverty." They argue that his use of vivid, even lyrical, language does not diminish the pain. Rather, it forces readers to feel it viscerally, to see the humanity that lies beneath the grime. The question remains, however, does the aestheticization of misery risk desensitizing the audience, turning tragedy into a form of entertainment? It is a tension that continues to animate debates about the role of art in representing suffering. A second line of critique comes from Marxist scholars who contend that Bukowski's work, while exposing the alienation of the working class, stops short of offering any systemic analysis or revolutionary solution. They argue that by focusing on individual experience, the lonely bartender, the drifter, the alcoholic, Bukowski inadvertently reinforces a narrative of personal failure rather than highlighting the capitalist structures that produce such conditions. In the Marxist Review of 1985, one essayist wrote, "Bukowski's poetry is a lament, not a call to arms. It names the wounds but never diagnoses the disease." In contrast, Bukowski's own statements suggest a different intention. In an interview with Rolling Stone in 1977, he said, "I'm not trying to write a political treatise. I'm trying to write the truth of my life, and the truth of my life is that the world is a mess and we're all stuck in it together." From this perspective, his refusal to prescribe a political solution can be read as a conscious choice to avoid the dogma that often accompanies overtly political literature. Instead, he offers a space for readers to feel the weight of that mess, perhaps prompting them to act in their own ways. The tension between representation and prescription is a long-standing one in literature, and Bukowski's work sits squarely in the middle, inviting us to consider whether bearing witness is itself a form of resistance. To deepen our understanding, we can situate Bukowski within the tradition of social realism, a movement that seeks to depict everyday life, especially the lives of the working class, in a realistic and often critical manner. John Steinbeck, perhaps the most celebrated American social realist, wrote novels such as The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men that portrayed the economic hardships of the Great Depression. Steinbeck's style is more expansive, his narratives often follow a larger cast of characters, and his political stance is more explicit, advocating for social reforms and collective action. Yet both Steinbeck and Bukowski share a commitment to exposing the lived realities of those left out of the American dream. In Steinbeck's The Grapes of Jode, the line, "I ain't never seen a man who's so sure he's right that he can't see he's wrong," echoes Bukowski's own skepticism toward the self-satisfaction of the middle class. Both writers use the ordinary as a lens for critique, but where Steinbeck often looks toward a hopeful resolution, Bukowski lingers in the gritty present, refusing to offer a tidy conclusion. This contrast highlights the evolution of social realism from a movement that sought reform to one that, in the post-industrial era, often embraces ambiguity and personal disillusionment. Another philosophical framework that enriches our reading of Bukowski's social critique is Emmanuel Levinas's concept of the other. Levinas argued that ethics arise not from abstract principles, but from the face-to-face encounter with another human being, an encounter that commands responsibility. When Bukowski writes, "The woman in the bar is beautiful, but her eyes hold a tired kindness," he is, in effect, presenting the other in a way that demands recognition. He refuses to reduce the woman to a stereotype. Instead, he offers a moment of ethical engagement, a pause that forces the reader to consider the weight of that gaze. Levinas would say that this moment of recognition is the starting point of ethical responsibility. Bukowski's narrative, though unadorned, thus becomes a site of ethical encounter, a place where the reader is called to see the face of the marginalized and to respond, even if only in the act of listening. In contemporary discourse, scholars and activists have begun to use the term street philosophy to describe the lived, practical wisdom that emerges from those who occupy the margins of society. Street philosophy is not a formal academic discipline. It is the collection of insights, survival strategies, and moral reflections that develop among people who navigate the harsh realities of homelessness, low-wage labor, and addiction. Bukowski's work can be read as a literary articulation of that philosophy. In Alone with Everybody, the line, "I'm a lonely man, but I'm not alone," captures a paradox that street philosophers often discuss: the coexistence of isolation and community. Moreover, his frequent references to the night shift and the barroom serve as metaphors for the liminal spaces where street philosophy is practiced, places where societal rules are suspended and where people negotiate their own codes of conduct. By bringing these experiences into the literary canon, Bukowski elevates street philosophy from a hidden, informal practice to a subject worthy of reflection and analysis. Let us revisit the story, The Most Beautiful Woman in Town, with an eye toward these philosophical underpinnings. In the story, the narrator describes the woman's tired kindness as if it were a beacon in a sea of indifference. He does not simply describe her appearance, he captures the ethical tension that Levinas describes, the face of the other that cannot be ignored. When the narrator says, "I could have walked past her, but something in her eyes made me stop," he is acknowledging the moment of responsibility that arises when we truly see another person. This moment is fleeting, but it is charged with moral significance. The story does not provide a solution. It does not suggest that the woman will be rescued or that the bar will be transformed, but it insists that the act of seeing, of acknowledging, is itself a small act of resistance against a society that prefers to look away. Similarly, in Alone with Everybody, the poet's confession that he is alone with everybody can be read as an admission of the failure of societal structures to provide genuine community. The poem's final stanza, where he writes, "I am a man who has never been able to keep his mouth shut about the things that bother me," suggests a moral imperative to speak, to break the silence that often surrounds the suffering of the marginalized. This insistence on speech resonates with the tradition of protest literature, yet Bukowski's approach is distinct. He does not rally crowds, he speaks to the individual reader, hoping that the personal recognition of suffering will ripple outward, perhaps prompting small acts of kindness or, at the very least, a shift in perception. Returning to the 1975 reading, we can see how Bukowski's spoken word performance functioned as a form of street philosophy in action. The act of reading his own work to an audience that lived the very conditions he described turned the literary text into a lived dialogue. The audience's reactions, the nods, the occasional tear, the murmured "that's me," illustrate how his words resonated beyond the page. In that room, the poem became a shared experience, a communal acknowledgement that the world's margins are not empty spaces, but vibrant, painful, and profoundly human. This moment also underscores a point that many literary critics miss: the power of oral tradition in amplifying the voices of the marginalized. By reading his work aloud, Bukowski tapped into a tradition that predates printed literature, one that relies on the immediacy of voice and the intimacy of shared space. In doing so, he created a bridge between the written word and the spoken word, reinforcing the idea that poetry can be a lived, communal practice, not merely an object of academic analysis. The 1979 New Yorker rejection, on the other hand, serves as a reminder of how institutional gatekeepers often marginalize voices that do not conform to their aesthetic expectations. The magazine's editorial board, steeped in a tradition of polished prose and subtle irony, found Bukowski's raw, unfiltered language incompatible with their brand. This rejection can be read as an example of what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called cultural capital, where the dominant class defines what is considered legitimate art, thereby maintaining its own power. Bukowski's response, refusing to alter his voice to fit the mainstream, can be seen as an act of cultural resistance. By continuing to publish in underground presses, in small literary magazines, and in his own collections, he bypassed the traditional channels of validation, thereby democratizing the production of literature. This act of defiance aligns with the Marxist critique that, while Bukowski may not propose a systematic overhaul, he does challenge the very mechanisms that uphold literary hierarchies. Now let us examine the counterargument that Bukowski romanticizes poverty. Consider the passage from The Most Beautiful Woman in Town where he writes, "She laughed, and the sound was like cheap whiskey spilling over a cracked bottle." Some readers interpret this as an aesthetic glorification of the setting. However, if we read the surrounding lines, we see that the narrator's admiration is tinged with melancholy, but the laughter was hollow, echoing off the walls that had seen more broken promises than hope. The juxtaposition of the cheap whiskey metaphor with the hollow echo reveals a tension that prevents simple romanticization. Bukowski's language is deliberately ambivalent, inviting the reader to feel both the allure and the emptiness. Moreover, his own life story, a series of odd jobs, a long stint as a postal worker, bouts of alcoholism and homelessness, provides a lived authenticity that complicates any claim of aesthetic exploitation. He is not an outsider looking in, he is an insider describing his own world. This insider status, while not absolving him of the risk of romanticization, does suggest that his work is rooted in lived experience rather than imagined exoticism. On the Marxist front, the critique that Bukowski offers no systemic analysis is a serious one. Yet, we must ask whether the expectation of a prescriptive political program is appropriate for a poet whose primary medium is personal narrative. Marxist literary theory often values works that expose the contradictions of capitalism, but it also acknowledges the role of critical consciousness, the awakening of the individual to the conditions of their oppression. Bukowski's vivid depictions of the working class, his unflinching portrayal of the alienation inherent in low-wage labor, and his insistence on naming the marginalized can be interpreted as fostering such consciousness. In his poem, The Laughing Heart, he writes, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a corner / by the men who think they know what's best for you." Though not overtly Marxist, this line encourages an individual to resist the forces that would confine them. By planting the seed of doubt, Bukowski may be performing a subtle, yet vital political act, prompting readers to question the structures that produce such alienation. To deepen our analysis, let us draw a parallel with Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath and its depiction of the Joad family's migration. Steinstein's narrative is imbued with a collective consciousness. The family's struggle becomes emblematic of the larger class struggle. Bukowski, by contrast, focuses on the singular, the solitary bartender, the lone drifter. Yet both approaches illuminate the same systemic failures. In Steinbeck's work, the Dust Bowl becomes a metaphor for the economic devastation wrought by unregulated capitalism. In Bukowski's work, the neon bar and rain-slicked alley become symbols of a society that discards its most vulnerable. The two writers, though stylistically divergent, converge on the insight that personal suffering is a symptom of larger social maladies. By placing Bukowski in dialogue with Steinstein, we can see how the tradition of social realism has evolved from collective narratives to more fragmented individual accounts, reflecting the changing nature of American labor and the rise of gig economy precarity. Turning again to Levinas, we can explore how Bukowski's portrayal of the other extends beyond the immediate characters to the very institutions that marginalize them. In Alone with Everybody, the poet writes, "The city lights are bright, but they never reach the corners where the night workers sleep." The city, an institution, is personified as a luminous but indifferent presence, illuminating everything except the spaces where the marginalized reside. Levinas would argue that this omission is an ethical failure. The city, as a collective other, neglects its responsibility to the vulnerable. Bukowski's poetic indictment, though not articulated in philosophical jargon, mirrors Levinas's call for an ethics that recognizes and responds to the invisible faces that populate our urban landscapes. In the realm of contemporary street philosophy, Scholars such as Angela Davis and Bell Hooks have emphasized the importance of listening to the narratives of the oppressed as a form of epistemic justice. Bukowski's work, by foregrounding the voices of drunks, homeless men, and low-wage workers, participates in that epistemic project. His stories become a form of testimonial literature, akin to the oral histories collected in the civil rights movement. The difference, however, is that Bukowski does not frame his subjects as heroic victims. He presents them as ordinary, flawed, and often self-destructive. This rawness challenges the tendency to romanticize the oppressed as noble martyrs, instead insisting that they are human beings with both virtues and vices. In doing so, Bukowski invites a more nuanced moral engagement, one that resists the simplification of complex social realities. Let us now consider a specific passage from Alone with Everybody that illustrates this nuance. I'm a man who has never been able to keep his mouth shut about the things that bother me / even when the world tells me to keep my head down. The line captures a tension between the societal pressure to remain silent and the individual's compulsion to speak out. This tension is central to many contemporary movements, from the Me Too protests to the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations, where marginalized voices demand to be heard despite systemic attempts to silence them. Bukowski's insistence on speaking, even when it is uncomfortable, anticipates these modern forms of protest, suggesting that his work can be read as an early precursor to the democratization of dissent that now thrives on social media platforms. To further illustrate Bukowski's impact, let us imagine a modern scenario. A community center in a gentrifying neighborhood decides to host a poetry night, inviting local residents, many of whom are low-income workers and recent immigrants. The organizer selects Bukowski's Alone with Everybody as the opening piece, hoping to create a space where participants feel seen. As the poem is read aloud, a young mother in the audience, who works 2 jobs as a cashier and a caregiver, feels a sudden recognition. The loneliness she feels in the crowded supermarket aisles mirrors the poet's Alone with Everybody. She later tells a friend, "I never thought a poem could name what I feel every day." In this anecdote, we see how Bukowski's work transcends its original context, becoming a tool for contemporary solidarity. The poem's capacity to articulate a universal sense of alienation, while rooted in a specific socio-economic milieu, demonstrates its enduring relevance. Another contemporary example can be found in a university sociology class, where students are assigned the most beautiful woman in town as part of a module on urban poverty. One student, coming from an affluent background, writes in her reflection paper, "I expected to read about suffering, but instead I felt a strange empathy for a woman I could not see." Bukowski forces me to confront my own privilege. The professor, noting this reaction, draws a parallel to Levinas's idea that the face of the other awakens an ethical responsibility. The classroom discussion then moves beyond literary analysis to a broader conversation about how societies allocate resources, how public policy neglects certain neighborhoods, and how personal empathy can translate into collective action. Through this pedagogical use, Bukowski's work becomes a catalyst for social critique, encouraging students to move from passive observation to active engagement. In both the community center and the classroom, Bukowski's text functions as a bridge between personal experience and collective awareness. This bridging function is perhaps the most significant aspect of his politics. He does not prescribe a manifesto, but he creates a space where the marginalized can be seen and where the privileged are invited to see them. In doing so, he aligns with the tradition of social realism, which seeks not only to depict reality, but to make that depiction a catalyst for change. Let us now turn to the language of Bukowski's own voice, the cadence that makes his work both accessible and unsettling. His sentences often mimic the rhythm of a barroom conversation. Short, clipped, occasionally stumbling, yet always moving forward. This stylistic choice mirrors the lived experience of his subjects, whose days are marked by irregular work hours, sudden bursts of activity, and long periods of waiting. In The Most Beautiful Woman in Town, the narrator's description of the woman's laugh as like cheap whiskey spilling over a cracked bottle employs a sensory metaphor that is both vivid and grounded in the material culture of the working class. The metaphor does not elevate the subject to a lofty ideal, it roots her in the everyday objects that define the environment. This grounding is essential to Bukowski's critique. By refusing to abstract his characters, he insists that their humanity is inseparable from their material conditions. Moreover, Bukowski's use of repetition, especially in Alone with Everybody, serves a rhetorical purpose. The refrain "alone, all alone / with everybody / and everything" creates a hypnotic echo that mirrors the cyclical nature of poverty, the endless loop of work, drink, and fleeting moments of connection. The repetition also functions as a form of insistence, a way of hammering home the inescapability of the condition, while simultaneously leaving room for the listener to imagine a break in the pattern. It is this tension between inevitability and possibility that gives Bukowski's social critique its subtle power. In considering the broader philosophical implications, we might ask, does Bukowski's focus on individual experience undermine collective action, or does it provide a necessary foundation for it? The answer may lie in the interplay between the personal and the political. By foregrounding the lived experiences of the marginalized, Bukowski creates a repository of narratives that can be mobilized for collective purposes. The stories of a woman at a bar, a man drinking alone, a homeless man listening to a poem, these are the threads that, when woven together, form a tapestry of systemic critique. The tapestry, however, requires an audience willing to see the pattern. This is where the role of the reader becomes crucial. When a reader encounters Bukowski's work and feels the weight of the tired kindness or the hollow laughter, they are invited to recognize a shared humanity that transcends class boundaries. In that recognition, the seeds of solidarity are sown. To further explore this dynamic, let us revisit Levinas's notion of infinity of the other. Levinas posits that the encounter with the other is never fully comprehensible. It always exceeds our capacity to reduce it to a concept. Bukowski's characters, in their rawness, resist easy categorization. The woman in the bar is not merely a symbol of beauty, she is a composite of desire, fatigue, and resilience. The drifter is not simply a stereotype of the homeless. He is a person who has learned to navigate a world that offers him few comforts. By refusing to simplify, Bukowski preserves the infinity that Levinas describes, thereby demanding an ethical response that is never complete but always ongoing. This ethical demand is precisely what makes his social critique enduring. It does not offer a final answer, but a perpetual invitation to engage. When we examine the historical context of the 1970s, the period in which Bukowski's most influential works were published, we see a nation grappling with the aftermath of the Vietnam War, an oil crisis, and a rising sense of disillusionment with the American dream. The working class, once celebrated in post-war prosperity, found itself increasingly invisible as deindustrialization began to hollow out cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. Bukowski's poems and stories capture this shift with a clarity that academic sociologists of the time often missed. While scholars measured unemployment rates and wage stagnation, Bukowski measured the smell of stale beer, the sound of a neon sign buzzing at 3 in the morning, and the silence that follows a night of drinking. These sensory details become a form of data, a qualitative account that complements quantitative analyses. In this sense, Bukowski's work can be read alongside the research of sociologists like William Julius Wilson, whose studies on urban poverty emphasize the lived experience of the underclass. Both Bukowski and Wilson, though working in different mediums, underscore the importance of hearing the voices of those who are often rendered invisible by statistics. The anecdote of Bukowski's 1975 reading also aligns with the tradition of oral poetry as a tool for social change. Historically, poets like Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance writers used spoken word performances to bring African American experiences into public consciousness. Bukowski's reading, though occurring in a different demographic context, follows a similar trajectory. The poet steps into a marginalized space, shares his work, and creates a moment of collective reflection. The difference lies in the audience's composition, primarily white, working-class individuals, which highlights the cross-class resonance of his work. By performing in a homeless shelter, Bukowski not only validates the experiences of his listeners, but also invites those from more privileged backgrounds to bear witness, thereby expanding the reach of his critique. Conversely, the 1979 New Yorker rejection illustrates the limits of that reach. The magazine's decision to reject Bukowski was not merely a matter of taste. It reflected a broader cultural gatekeeping that prioritized certain narratives over others. In the words of the editor's letter, "Your work is powerful, but it does not fit the tone we cultivate." This statement, while polite, reveals an implicit bias. The tone of the literary establishment is one that excludes the gritty, unvarnished language of the streets. Bukowski's refusal to alter his voice, as seen in his terse reply, "I'm not trying to fit into your aesthetic," becomes an act of defiance that underscores his commitment to authenticity. This defiance can be read as a micro-political act, one that challenges the hegemony of cultural institutions and asserts the legitimacy of outsider art. In responding to the criticism that Bukowski romanticizes poverty, we might consider a passage from his novel Post Office where he writes, "I am a man who has never been able to keep his mouth shut about the things that bother me, even when the world tells me to keep my head down." Here, the things that bother me include the monotony of his postal job, the alienation of his coworkers, and his own self-destructive habits. The honesty of this confession prevents any romantic veneer. It is a stark admission of the psychological toll of low-wage labor. When readers interpret the sweet smell of cheap whiskey as romantic, they may be overlooking the broader context in which Bukowski frames that smell as a coping mechanism for harsh reality. The line functions as both a sensory detail and a critique of a society that pushes individuals toward such coping mechanisms. The Marxist critique, however, remains potent. Marxist theorist Terry Eagleton has argued that literature that merely depicts oppression without proposing a revolutionary alternative risks becoming complicit in the status quo. Bukowski's lack of an explicit call for systemic overhaul can be seen as a shortcoming from this perspective. Yet we might counter that Bukowski's work operates within a tradition of critical consciousness that seeks to awaken readers to the contradictions of capitalism, even if it does not prescribe a specific solution. In Alone with Everybody, the repeated emphasis on the isolation of the individual amidst a crowd can be interpreted as a critique of capitalist alienation, a concept that Marx himself described as the estrangement of man from himself. Bukowski's poetic articulation of that estrangement, therefore, aligns with Marxist analysis, even if it stops short of proposing a concrete program of change. In contemporary discussions of street philosophy, scholars like Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have explored how the everyday practices of the marginalized generate new forms of resistance. They argue that the plurality of the multitude, the diverse, decentralized groups that occupy urban spaces, can create new political possibilities outside traditional party politics. Bukowski's portrayal of the barroom, the alley, the night shift can be read as an early literary representation of this multitude. By giving voice to these dispersed individuals, Bukowski maps a terrain of potential resistance that is not organized through unions or parties, but through shared experience and mutual recognition. This perspective reframes his lack of a systematic proposal not as a deficiency, but as an accurate depiction of how resistance often emerges, organically from the ground up, through everyday acts of solidarity and storytelling. To bring these threads together, let us imagine a synthesis. A reader, perhaps a graduate student in philosophy, picks up Bukowski's Love is a Dog from Hell after reading a scholarly article on Levinas and the ethics of the other. The student is struck by the line in the poem, The Laughing Heart, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a corner / by the men who think they know what's best for you." The student reflects on how this line resonates with Levinas's call to recognize the other's infinite demand and with Marxist critiques of capitalist exploitation. The student then writes a paper that argues that Bukowski's poetry, while rooted in personal experience, functions as a form of ethical philosophy that bridges the gap between abstract theory and lived reality. The paper is later presented at a conference on literature and social justice, where scholars from sociology, philosophy, and literary studies engage in a dialogue that highlights Bukowski's relevance across disciplines. In this imagined scenario, Bukowski's work transcends its original context, becoming a touchstone for interdisciplinary inquiry and a catalyst for contemporary social critique. Finally, let us consider the lasting legacy of Bukowski's politics of the marginalized. In an age where social media amplifies both the voices of the oppressed and the noise of performative activism, Bukowski's quiet, unadorned style offers a reminder that genuine critique does not require grand gestures. It requires presence, observation, and a willingness to speak the uncomfortable truths that many prefer to ignore. His stories and poems become small lanterns in the dark alleys of modern cities, illuminating the faces that pass by unnoticed. By reading his work, by listening to his voice, we are invited to pause, to see, and perhaps to act. The politics of the marginalized, as articulated by Bukowski, is not a manifesto of revolution. It is an invitation to bear witness, to name the invisible, and to recognize that the most beautiful woman in town and the lonely man with everyone are not fictional constructs, but real people whose lives shape the fabric of our society. In that recognition lies the seed of change, however modest, that can grow into a broader movement for justice. And perhaps in the quiet echo of his words, we find the space to imagine a world where the barroom lights shine a little brighter for everyone, where the city's neon signs do not blind us to the corners that need our attention, and where the voice of the marginalized is no longer a whisper, but a chorus that we cannot afford to ignore. When we step back from the smoky bars and the ink-stained pages of Charles Bukowski, we find a figure whose voice still reverberates through the corridors of contemporary culture. It is easy to think of him merely as a hard-boiled poet of the underground, a cult hero whose name flickers on the covers of cheap paperback collections. Yet when we trace the threads of his influence, they weave through modern music, spoken word performance, internet memes, and even the very way many of us articulate our own existential doubts. In this segment, we will explore how Bukowski's raw, unapologetic philosophy has become a kind of informal doctrine for a generation that feels both liberated and alienated, and we will examine the arguments that both celebrate and critique his legacy. Bukowski's work has always been about the everyday grind, about finding meaning, or at least a kind of honest defiance in the mundane. He wrote, "I'm a drunk, a poet, a lover of women, and a lover of life, and I'm not a god, I'm a man." That line, simple yet profound, captures the essence of what many later creators have tried to emulate. A philosophy that does not hide behind lofty abstractions, but instead embraces the gritty texture of lived experience. This is why, decades after his death, his words continue to surface in unexpected places. One of the most striking contemporary echoes comes from spoken word artist Shane Koiksen. In his poem The Most Beautiful Thing, Koiksen explicitly references Bukowski, saying, "I'm trying to be the kind of man Bukowski wrote about, flawed, bruised, and still breathing." Koiksen's delivery, with its measured cadence and breath-filled pauses, mirrors the cadence of Bukowski's own readings, where each pause is a moment for the listener to feel the weight of the line. Koiksen's work often explores the tension between vulnerability and resilience, a tension that is at the heart of Bukowski's own poetic project. By invoking Bukowski, Koiksen not only pays homage, but also signals to his audience that the same raw honesty that defined mid-century American poetry can still serve as a compass for navigating today's emotional landscape. The resonance of Bukowski's philosophy extends beyond spoken word into visual media as well. In 2015, Netflix released the documentary Bukowski, A Life in Poetry. The film, directed by John Miller, intersperses archival footage of Bukowski reading his own work with interviews from contemporary poets, musicians, and even a few psychologists. One striking moment features poet and cultural critic Mary Carr, who says, "Bukowski taught us that the ordinary can be a battlefield, and the battlefield can be ordinary." The documentary frames Bukowski not merely as a literary figure, but as an existential provocateur whose insistence on confronting the banal with brutal honesty has become a template for modern artistic expression. The film's reception highlighted how his philosophy has been reinterpreted through the lens of today's media consumption, short, punchy, and emotionally direct, much like the clips that dominate social platforms. Speaking of platforms, the digital age has given Bukowski's aphorisms a new lease on life, sometimes in the most surprising ways. In 2020, a TikTok trend exploded, built around the line, "Find what you love and let it kill you." Users paired the phrase with everything from footage of intense marathon training to scenes of late-night coding sessions. The caption often read, "Live fast, love harder." The trend was not merely a meme, it was a collective meditation on the paradox of passion. Viewers would pause the video, stare at the words, and reflect on whether their own pursuits were nurturing or self-destructive. In the comments, many quoted Bukowski's longer poem, The Laughing Heart, where he writes, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a safe house / you are the only one who can be your own." The TikTok phenomenon illustrates how Bukowski's stark, almost nihilistic encouragement to embrace one's desires has been repurposed as a rallying cry for authenticity in a world saturated with curated perfection. The 2009 posthumous publication of The Last Night of the Earth adds another layer to the philosophical reception of Bukowski's work. The collection, compiled from previously unpublished poems and fragments, arrived at a time when the world was still grappling with the aftershocks of the 2008 financial crisis. Critics noted that the poems, though unfinished, carried a palpable sense of urgency and disillusionment. In The New Yorker, literary critic James Wood wrote, "Bukowski's late verses are less about the barroom brawl and more about the quiet surrender to a world that has already given up on its promises." Scholars of contemporary existentialism seized upon this, arguing that Bukowski's later work prefigured what Alain de Botton later termed the philosophy of everyday life, the idea that profound insight can be extracted from the routine, from the coffee-stained desk, from the evening commute. De Botton's own writings on everyday philosophy echo Bukowski's insistence that meaning is not a grand revelation, but a series of small, honest recognitions. In this way, The Last Night of the Earth became a touchstone for a new generation of thinkers who sought to bridge high philosophy with low-brow experience. Bukowski's influence also finds a home in music, where his raw aesthetic aligns with the ethos of several alternative and indie bands. The 1990s grunge movement, with its lyrical preoccupation with alienation and self-destruction, borrowed heavily from Bukowski's tone. Kurt Cobain famously listed Bukowski among his favorite writers, and songs like Smells Like Teen Spirit echo the poet's disdain for conformity. Here We Are Now Entertain Us feels like a modernist echo of Bukowski's line, I'm not a poet, I'm a drunk. More recently, the indie folk band The National has referenced Bukowski in their lyricism, using his imagery of the night's a black dog that bites the streetlight to convey urban melancholy. These musical appropriations are not mere name-dropping. They embed Bukowski's philosophy into the emotional scaffolding of songs that reach millions, reinforcing the idea that his worldview continues to shape how we articulate discontent and desire. But it would be reductive to claim that Bukowski's legacy is universally celebrated. One persistent counterargument frames him as a cult hero, whose appeal is limited to a niche subculture of misfits and bohemians. Critics argue that his glorification of alcoholism, promiscuity, and a kind of macho nihilism romanticizes self-destruction without offering constructive alternatives. In a 2018 essay for The Guardian, cultural critic Marina Sedman wrote, Bukowski's mythos is a comfortable coat for those who want to excuse their own inertia behind the veil of authenticity. From this perspective, Bukowski's influence is seen as a nostalgic echo of a bygone era, a relic that appeals only to those who relish the idea of the tortured artist, rather than to a broader audience seeking philosophical guidance. Another critique emerges from the digital age's unique brand of alienation. Some scholars argue that Bukowski's philosophy, rooted in the physicality of bars, streets, and paper, feels out of step with a world where interaction is increasingly mediated by screens. In a 2021 paper published in Digital Culture and Society, sociologist Dr. Leila Gonzalez contends, Bukowski's emphasis on bodily experience and visceral immediacy runs counter to the hyper-mediated, fragmented attention spans of today's internet generation. She suggests that while Bukowski's rawness may inspire a momentary surge of authenticity, it does not address the systemic loneliness engendered by social media algorithms. According to this view, the anti-self-help literature that has emerged, books like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F by Mark Manson, which adopt a blunt, no-nonsense tone, offers a more relevant framework for navigating digital alienation because it explicitly acknowledges the paradox of choice and the overload of information that defines contemporary life. These critiques, however, open a space for a more nuanced conversation. If we consider Bukowski alongside the philosophy of the everyday movement championed by Elaine de Botton, we see a convergence rather than a clash. De Botton argues that philosophy should be a practical tool, embedded in daily routines, helping us to make sense of ordinary moments. Bukowski, though far more abrasive, also insists on confronting the ordinary head-on. In The Laughing Heart, he writes, "Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a safe house / you are the only one who can be your own." Both thinkers urge us to claim ownership of our lived experience, to resist the seduction of easy comforts. The difference lies in tone. De Botton offers gentle guidance. Bukowski delivers a punch in the gut. Together, they illustrate that the spectrum of everyday philosophy ranges from soothing to confrontational, each serving a purpose in helping individuals navigate the complexities of modern existence. The anti-self-help genre, too, can be seen as a descendant of Bukowski's irreverent stance. While traditional self-help books promise transformation through positive affirmations and structured plans, anti-self-help titles embrace the messiness of life. In The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F, Mark Manson quotes Bukowski directly, "You have to die a few times before you can really live." Manson's use of Bukowski's line is not decorative. It signals an alignment with a philosophy that accepts suffering as an integral part of growth. By integrating Bukowski's stark realism, anti-self-help authors provide a bridge between the poet's raw authenticity and the reader's desire for actionable insight. This synthesis suggests that Bukowski's influence is not confined to literary circles, but has seeped into the broader self-improvement market, reshaping how we talk about personal development. The internet's role in proliferating Bukowski's ideas cannot be overstated. Beyond TikTok, the proliferation of quote-image memes, often called quote cards, has turned his aphorisms into visual shorthand for a generation seeking quick, digestible wisdom. A simple black and white graphic featuring the line, "If you're going to try, go all the way," circulates alongside motivational posts, appearing in feeds of users who may never have read a full poem. This democratization of his words, while sometimes stripping them of context, nevertheless amplifies their reach. It also raises an interesting philosophical question. Does the fragmentation of a poet's work into bite-size memes dilute its meaning, or does it create a new form of collective interpretation? In the words of media theorist Henry Jenkins, participatory culture transforms the audience into co-creators, reauthoring texts in ways that reflect their own lived realities. Bukowski's terse, punchy lines are perfectly suited for this kind of participatory remixing, allowing each individual to project their own experience onto his words. Returning to the 2009 publication of The Last Night of the Earth, it is worth noting how scholars interpreted the collection's philosophical undercurrents. One in contemporary literature argued that the unfinished nature of the poems mirrors the existential condition of incompleteness that Jean-Paul Sartre described as being for itself, a consciousness perpetually aware of its own lack of finality. The essayist Dr. Elena Marquez wrote, "Bukowski's fragments are not failures, they are intentional open-ended invitations for the reader to co-construct meaning." This perspective aligns Bukowski with existentialist traditions that emphasize personal responsibility in creating one's own values, even when the world offers no clear blueprint. In this sense, Bukowski becomes a conduit for existentialist thought, albeit expressed in a language far removed from the academic treatises of Sartre or Camus. Analogies help us to grasp the peculiar way Bukowski's philosophy operates in modern culture. Imagine a city's subway system, a labyrinth of tunnels where each station represents a different facet of daily life, work, love, boredom, pain. Bukowski is the graffiti artist who tags the walls with raw, unfiltered commentary. The tags are not polished advertisements, they are blunt, sometimes vulgar, but they force commuters to confront the walls they usually ignore. Similarly, Shane Coixon's spoken word performances act as a subway announcer, amplifying Bukowski's tags so that the entire carriage can hear them. The 2020 TikTok trend functions like a flash mob in the subway, where strangers briefly share a moment of collective reflection before dispersing back into their individual routes. Each of these cultural moments, though distinct in medium, shares a common purpose: to interrupt the monotony, to remind us that the everyday is charged with potential meaning if we dare to look at it unflinchingly. Historical anecdotes further illuminate the ways Bukowski's legacy has been reinterpreted. In the early 1990s, a group of German punk musicians formed a band called the Bukowski Kids, naming themselves after a chance meeting with a Bukowski reading at a Berlin club. They claimed that his unapologetic embrace of the underclass gave them permission to write lyrics about the disenfranchised youth of post-reunification Germany. Decades later, the band's frontman, Klaus Roeder, reflected in an interview, "Bukowski gave us a language to talk about the emptiness of our streets without romanticizing it." This anecdote shows how Bukowski's rawness transcended national boundaries, offering a linguistic toolkit for those grappling with social upheaval. Another anecdote involves the late 2000s emergence of Bukowski cafes in cities like Tokyo and Melbourne. These cafes, often decorated with vintage typewriters and framed excerpts of his poems, served as gathering spots for writers, artists, and students. In Melbourne's Typewriter Bar, owner Hana Miyazaki recounts, "We wanted a space where people could write, drink, and feel the grit of Bukowski's world without the pretension of a literary salon." The cafes became informal think tanks where discussions ranged from the philosophy of alcohol as a social lubricant to debates on whether Bukowski's cynicism was a form of resistance against capitalist commodification. These spaces illustrate how Bukowski's work has been institutionalized in contemporary cultural practices, becoming a backdrop for philosophical dialogue. The influence of Bukowski on musicians continues to surface in unexpected collaborations. In 2018, the electronic duo, The Glitch Project, released an album titled Poet's Blood, sampling Bukowski's readings over ambient synth textures. The track Night Shift overlays the line "I'm a night owl, an old dog, a broken heart" with a pulsating bass line, creating a sonic environment where Bukowski's words become a meditation on the nocturnal labor of the modern gig economy. Critics praised the album for its ability to translate Bukowski's literary grit into a digital soundscape, suggesting that his philosophy can adapt to new artistic forms without losing its core intensity. When we examine the modern relevance of Bukowski's philosophy, we must also consider the broader cultural shift toward anti-self-help. This movement, characterized by a rejection of overly optimistic self-improvement narratives, aligns closely with Bukowski's disdain for platitudes. Authors like Sarah Knight, in her book The Dark Side of Happiness, argue that embracing discomfort is essential for authentic growth. Knight cites Bukowski's line, You have to die a few times before you can really live, as a reminder that pain is not a barrier but a gateway. By positioning Bukowski as a predecessor to anti-self-help, we see his influence extending beyond poetry into a broader philosophical stance that challenges the dominant cultural narrative of perpetual positivity. Yet the critiques remain potent. Some argue that Bukowski's celebration of self-destructive habits, drinking, gambling, promiscuity, cannot be divorced from the very systems that perpetuate inequality. Feminist scholars such as Dr. Priya Singh contend that Bukowski's depictions of women often reinforce misogynistic tropes, thereby limiting the universal applicability of his philosophy. Singh writes, while Bukowski's raw honesty can be empowering for some, it also perpetuates a gendered narrative that marginalizes women's experiences. This criticism forces us to confront the darker shadows within Bukowski's oeuvre and to ask whether his philosophical contributions can be salvaged or must be reframed in light of contemporary ethical standards. The dialogue between Bukowski's raw realism and de Botton's measured optimism offers a productive way forward. De Botton's philosophy of everyday life encourages us to find meaning in routine through reflective practices such as journaling or mindful observation. Bukowski, in contrast, urges us to confront the messiness of those routines without sugarcoating. Imagine a daily practice where, after a morning commute, you write a short note to yourself. Today I will drink the coffee I love, but I will not let it drown me. This hybrid approach acknowledges the pleasure of indulgence while maintaining a guard against excess, a balance that both thinkers, in their own ways, seem to advocate. In the realm of internet culture, the juxtaposition of Bukowski's aphorisms with meme aesthetics creates a new philosophical genre. The Bukowski meme often pairs a bleak image, a rain-soaked alley, a cracked bottle, with a line like "Find what you love and let it kill you." The visual contrast amplifies the tension between desire and destruction. As digital anthropologist Dr. Maya Lin observes, these memes function as modern parables, allowing users to process existential anxiety in a format that is instantly shareable. The meme, therefore, becomes a vessel for a philosophy that is both personal and communal, echoing the way oral traditions once spread wisdom through storytelling. The 2020 TikTok trend also demonstrates how Bukowski's ideas can be reframed as a call to authenticity rather than self-destruction. Users often paired the quote with footage of themselves engaging in creative pursuits, painting, cooking, coding, while acknowledging the sacrifices involved. The comment sections frequently turned into supportive dialogues, with participants encouraging each other to let it kill you in the sense of fully committing to one's passion, not literally succumbing to it. This reinterpretation suggests that Bukowski's words have been repurposed to fit a contemporary ethic of wholehearted engagement, a principle echoed in contemporary existentialist thought that emphasizes authentic existence as a response to absurdity. Yet the digital reinterpretation also raises the question of whether the original intent is being lost. Bukowski's own life was marked by hardship, poverty, and a relentless struggle against the forces that would have silenced him. When his words are stripped of that context and applied as motivational slogans, do we risk erasing the very critique of society that gave his work its edge? This tension mirrors the broader debate about the commodification of countercultural icons. As cultural theorist Susan Brown notes, when radical voices become brand assets, their subversive power can be neutralized. The challenge, then, is to preserve Bukowski's critical edge while allowing his insights to inspire constructive action. Cross-referencing with other contemporary thinkers helps to map this terrain. The British philosopher Julian Baggini, in his book The Edge of Reason, discusses how the everyday philosopher must navigate the line between cynicism and hope. He cites Bukowski alongside Camus, noting that both recognize the absurd but differ in tone. Camus offers a call to revolt, while Bukowski offers a howl. By juxtaposing these voices, Baggini suggests that a robust philosophical outlook requires both the fire of Bukowski's defiance and the measured resolve of Camus's rebellion. Similarly, the rise of anti-self-help literature has been championed by authors like David Goggins, whose memoir Can't Hurt Me shares a kinship with Bukowski's insistence on confronting pain head-on. Goggins writes, "You have to be willing to suffer the truth." While Goggins frames his narrative around physical endurance, the underlying philosophy aligns with Bukowski's belief that only through hardship can one discover a genuine sense of self. Both figures reject the notion that comfort is the ultimate goal, instead positing that growth emerges from the crucible of struggle. The legacy of Bukowski also manifests in visual art. In 2016, street artist Banksy created a piece in Los Angeles that featured a wall covered in graffiti reading, Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a safe house. The line, directly lifted from Bukowski, was painted over a corporate billboard advertising luxury apartments. The juxtaposition served as a visual critique of gentrification, echoing Bukowski's disdain for the commodification of human experience. This act demonstrates how his words can be repurposed as tools of social commentary, bridging literary philosophy with activist art. When we examine the broader cultural impact, we see that Bukowski's influence is not limited to isolated pockets, but rather forms a network of references that intersect across media. The spoken word artist Shane Koikson, the Netflix documentary, TikTok trends, punk bands, cafe cultures, and street art all constitute nodes in a larger web of philosophical diffusion. Each node adapts Bukowski's core ideas, embracing the messy, the painful, the authentic to its own context, thereby ensuring that his philosophy remains dynamic rather than static. In considering the counterarguments, it is crucial to acknowledge that the cult hero label does hold weight for certain audiences. For some, Bukowski remains an emblem of rebellion against mainstream literary norms, a figure whose very existence validates an outsider identity. Yet the fact that his work has migrated from underground zines to mainstream streaming platforms suggests that his relevance has expanded beyond a niche. The transformation from cult status to cultural touchstone indicates a shift in how society values raw authenticity. The critique that Bukowski's philosophy is outdated in an age of digital alienation also invites a deeper examination. While it is true that his world was largely analog, bars, typewriters, paper, his core insight that the only thing that keeps you going is the hope of a better tomorrow resonates with those navigating the fragmented attention of social media. The digital alienation many feel is not merely a product of technology, but a symptom of a deeper existential disconnection. Bukowski's insistence on confronting that disconnection, even if expressed through the language of alcohol and physical labor, offers a template for confronting digital emptiness. Engage directly, feel the discomfort, and refuse to hide behind curated personas. Finally, let us reflect on what it means for Bukowski to be considered a modern philosopher. Philosophy in its most expansive sense is the love of wisdom, a pursuit that can be found in poetry, music, memes, and everyday conversation. Bukowski, with his unvarnished prose, invites us to ask the hard questions. What does it mean to live honestly in a world that rewards pretense? How do we reconcile desire with self-destruction? Can we find meaning in the drudgery of work, the ache of love, the sting of failure? These are not abstract puzzles. They are lived realities. By threading his voice through contemporary mediums, whether through Shane Koikson's spoken word, a Netflix documentary, or a TikTok caption, society is, in effect, holding a mirror to itself, using Bukowski's raw reflections to examine its own image. In the end, Bukowski's legacy is a tapestry woven from threads of admiration, critique, adaptation, and reinterpretation. He stands as a bridge between the existentialist philosophers of the mid-20th century and the anti-self-help writers of today, between the gritty barroom poet and the digital influencer. His words continue to be quoted, meme-ified, and debated, proving that the philosophy of the everyday can be both brutal and beautiful. As we close this exploration, perhaps the most fitting Bukowski line to carry forward is from The Laughing Heart. Your life is your life / don't let it be clubbed into a safe house / you are the only one who can be your own. May we take that invitation seriously, allowing his unapologetic honesty to guide us as we navigate the noisy, fragmented world of the 21st century.